Hello, hello. Sorry, I got you in the middle of eating. Uh,
Yeah, fine.
yeah, no problem. This is my friend Claire. Flotrace is away this week, and Claire is kindly filling in for him, so I have somebody to talk to. Um, Anything you want to say to introduce yourself, Claire?
Um, I'm an illustrator and designer from California. I have interest in politics and geopolitics and history and a bunch of other stuff. But
Oh yeah, cool. Actually, that's like basically exactly what I was going to say to introduce you if you didn't say it. So that's good to know. Claire's a very good artist, by the way. She likes to draw like soldier women and tanks and sci-fi stuff.
I'm all right. I'm all right.
Yeah. So anyway, today we are going to be talking about a video essay on anti-war films, and
Mhm.
this isn't the topic that I know a lot about. So I thought this would be a good opportunity to learn about it. What got you interested in covering this?
Um, I mean the channel is one of my favorite YouTube channels, so that's already a plus. Like I pretty much sit through like all of their every time they release a video, I like watch all of it. And then I like decompress it because they have like a pretty diverse range of topics that are approached in a way that's not normal for at least the spaces we're in. It's a lot more like contemplative and introspective, and there's lots of talks about like this thing makes me feel this way. I don't know how this person approached this thing, or I can sympathize with these movies. I know like Stories of Old has another video where they talk about spiritualism in film and struggling with faith, and I thought that video was interesting because they're approaching it from like I'm not a religious like person at all, but I seem to find a like kindred spirit in movies that deal with like sorts of existential crises or struggles with faith or something. So like they have a mature way of like dealing with like subject matter in a way that's interesting that I don't really see anywhere else. And then
Okay.
obviously like war related topics are always interesting to me, especially with like how people perceive them like through media and stuff like that.
Oh, cool. This is mainly like the YouTube channel is mainly about film or like media criticism and stuff. Is that right?
It's mostly about film. It it's not about necessarily like the technical things about film. Like it's not. He has a podcast with another one of my favorite film YouTubers, Thomas Flay, and Thomas Flight's channel deals a lot more with like the technical aspects of filmmaking, whereas his channel deals more with like here's stuff from movies and let's like explore like different topics through movies, right? So like he has another video on like the masculine purpose, existentialism, nihilism, stuff like that. But he's like using film as like a medium to like explore those topics.
Okay, so
Um,
it's mainly on like
yeah.
the storytelling aspects of films.
Storytelling, and then he's also like pretty. It seems to be pretty well read on philosophical topics too. So if you're familiar with like those areas, you'll probably pick up on that. But it just seems like an all around like introspective person. So, but yeah, film is like the main venue for that like
Oh,
approach
okay,
because like
cool.
it's a good cornerstone to like get people into it.
And I think anti-war films specifically, like that topic seems like it should have a lot of interesting ethical questions around it about how to depict war. And I think you and I were
Hmm.
briefly talking about this yesterday, where it seems like a lot of films seem to just want to do this thing, or maybe I should say, a lot of critics of film want films to just depict war equals bad with like
Hmm.
that kind of simplistic message with nothing more
Yeah.
to it, which I think we generally agree that war equals
Hmm.
bad, and
Yeah.
nevertheless you can have more nuance in the way you
Hmm.
present it. Um,
Do you want me to do you want me to share my screen and then you can go over it, or do you want
yeah,
to do
yeah.
that?
If you can
Okay.
just
Ba, 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 ba. Um, Hold on. Let me get this. Let me come back here, and then should be this one. Okay. I think. Yeah, this is the video, right?
yeah,
Just making
perfect.
sure.
Can
Yeah.
we
Okay.
check for a second if the volume level's good?
Hmm. Let's see. Is it too loud, or
No, it's perfect. Thank you.
is that too loud, or?
It's good. It's good.
Okay. Okay.
Personal ambition must be thrown aside in the one great sacrifice for our country.
I cannot think of many film-related subjects that come with as much complexity as that of the cinematic depiction of war. Between the contradictory statements of famous directors, like Truffaut saying that every film about war ends up being pro-war, and Spielberg claiming that every war film, good or bad, is anti-war, there appears to be a lot of ambiguity about what it is that war films actually communicate. Definitions of what it really means to make an anti-war film therefore also remain vague and inconclusive. In an article from the BBC, California State University professor of philosophy Dennis Rothermel said that anti-war films must at least portray a nuanced view of deadly combat, one that depicts the infliction of lethal violence as a norm of behavior, and as a force striking down randomly. In the same article, New York University film professor Cheryl Antonio said that they have to show both sides. They have to ask if war is just a national tragedy for the victor, or if it is terrible for everybody.
If we threw away these rifles and these uniforms, you could be my brother.
There are plenty of war films that meet these criteria, but for
And then
many
just
of
like let
them,
me know
they
when you
are
want to
not
pause it
enough
or
to
anything.
definitively
Yeah.
label them as anti-war.
And if you want to,
In fact,
you can
many
whenever
of
you
them
want
are
to.
heavily debated for having the exact opposite effect, like American Sniper, or even some classics like Saving Private Ryan or Full Metal Jacket.
Good night, ladies.
One complicating factor is that making a film with certain intentions doesn't mean it will be perceived accordingly. Apocalypse Now, for example, is a slow-burning journey into a heart of darkness that comments on the dehumanizing effects of war, but also contains some isolated scenes, most notably the Ride of the Valkyries, that communicate the excitement of warfare so effectively that the larger context it is placed in is easily forgotten. While such misinterpretation
Just
is
to pause that one scene, it's funny because the scene that this movie is from with Jake Gyllenhaal is Jarhead. I don't know if you've seen it.
No.
It was kind of a lot of service members that I've talked to, whether they're in service or they're out, talk about it like really describing like that period of the military life really well. It doesn't have a lot of combat in it. The whole conflict about that movie there is that like it takes place during Desert Storm, and Desert Storm was such like a short conflict that like he shows up and they're all training for this thing, and then like he doesn't even get to fire like a weapon once to like in like the entirety of that war, right? But that scene is like juxtaposed with like, yeah, Apocalypse Now, it does have serious commentaries on war, even though some people might not view it that way, especially the most famous scene where the helicopters right into the Ride of the Valkyrie song. And that's exactly what that movie does in Jarhead, is that all the Marines are sitting in a movie theater watching that scene and they're all cheering for it. But the context of that within the movie is that this is clearly like a bad thing that is happening. But it's like, even within just media, we see like a representation of that happening. So I thought that was like clever, but
if this character wants to go to war but then doesn't really get to participate in it, I'm wondering how that's depicted. Like, does he end up being disappointed that he doesn't get to fight?
In Jarhead, it is. Yeah, it's viewed as like he is disappointed that like I trained for this thing and I really want to do it, and then I basically get blocked from doing it, and it's a very frustrating. Like the characters are very frustrated, especially because like from what I remember, Jarhead, it does have some stuff like you're never gonna escape that feeling of like being in an environment with other people. You're gonna build some type of camaraderie, especially the military, even if it's like extremely monotonous or boring. So those things you could view positively, but there's also like a lot of stuff that it touches upon. It talks about like, or it doesn't talk about, but some stuff that happens is like it shows like some relationships falling apart, marriages falling apart because being long distance in the military is really hard. You have some people dealing with like after being out, if I remember correctly, but there is like a conflict with the characters of like, I wanted to do this thing and I didn't get to do it, and that's like extremely frustrating. But even like it's not necessarily that like in real life audiences are dealing with that, but even within like war films themselves, they are approaching that concept, I think, a little bit. So
yeah, so I guess it seems like what they're touching on there is not even the ethics of a war underway. It's more the ethics of the way that the public perceives the war and like our will to participate or not participate in it.
Yeah, that movie did at least. I would recommend like everyone go watch it. It's a really good commentary on that stuff. But it is one of those. It's so hard because it is one of those movies that just try to critique some things, but if you just walk away from it and you're like, oh, but there's cool stuff in there that I want to do also, it's like you can never get out of this circular trap of like trying to critique something and then people coming away with the wrong impression, or like people going like, I actually do like that thing, I do want to do that. But
yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that the idea is like, why do we think war is bad is because it's dangerous and destructive and costly, and you could just depict those things through 99% of a movie, and then people could still look at the last 1% and it just yeah.
Especially now, it's like, oh, what's going to be the most popular clip on YouTube, right? It's going to be the cool stuff. It's not going to be the boring or like introspective or contemplative scenes, right? Like it's going to be all the war scenes where everything's cool is happening. But oh, sorry.
Bound to happen, as filmmakers can never fully control the reactions to their work, nor can they account for every specific worldview that is projected onto it. They can definitely muddle their own message by not thoroughly considering the effect their images really have. Just look at, as the channel Every Frame a Painting pointed out, how Michael Bay filmed the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor with the same cinematic spectacle that is also seen in fictional blockbuster adventures, and that he himself would later use to create exciting action scenes in the Transformer films.
That's a funny
Tell another
juxtaposition.
real-life story in 13 hours. To illustrate, contrast this shot from Pearl Harbor with a similar moment in the film Midway, in which the point of view remains with the Americans under attack, and not the spectacle. Well, mostly. A better example is Dunkirk, in which the point of view is so restricted that the danger becomes a constantly ominous presence, and the spectacle terrifying. The Russian film Come and See takes this even further by presenting a fully subjective experience from the point of view of a young boy. This implies, among other things, that we not only hear the sounds he hears in the world around him, but also the sounds that are haunting his mind, thereby connecting us even closer to the traumatic effects war has on the human psyche. However, despite the amount of care and consideration that is given to the depiction of warfare, another complicating factor is that the audience is, and will always be, observing it from a safe and comfortable distance. And so, however realistic the feeling, however profound our catharsis at the end, the experience is always a simulated one. It is never the same as going through the real thing. So this is a question that can be brought up in the general context of our consumption of stories. When it comes to something as impactful as war, it is fair to question how and to what extent this matters. These are but a few of many issues that illustrate our complex relation to war films, and by extension, to war itself. So what does all this mean for the anti-war film? Well, that's what we're here to find out. The goal of this discussion, however, is not to end up with another dichotomy to label films as either pro or anti-war, but to construct a deeper understanding of a complicated subject that does not let itself be captured in such simplified terms. So today, let's deconstruct humanity at its most destructive. Examine what the narrative, cinematic, and contextual elements of war films communicate to us, how they reflect and shape our perception of war, and explore the purpose and meaning of witnessing the darkness of warfare through cinema. Or in the words of novelist Thomas Hardy, if a way to the better there be, it exacts a full look at the worst.
I think there's he talks about how it's always going to be removed from like the viewer, like no matter what you do. It's like a broader critique of art in a way. Unless it's there are some things where it's not like that. I think depending on the music, I think music is probably one where that doesn't happen as much, because like the act of listening to music is like you are listening to it. That is something you are doing. Maybe like you're not playing the instruments, but like you're hearing the effects of them as if, you know, they were playing right next to you.
Yeah, it's not like explicitly depicting a certain time and place that you're removed from in any case. Yeah.
Yeah. I always go back and forth. I know there's like really extreme takes of like, well, you shouldn't write about this if you don't come from this background, or you shouldn't make this type of art if you don't come from this background. I personally don't hold that perspective. I think like you should be able, like art is like one of the few places where I think it's like actually the marketplace of ideas. Like you should be able to put whatever you want out there, and then you're going to get a bunch of critique. And if people hate it, then they hate it, or if people love it, then they love it. Or if it's viewed as good, then it's good, and then if it's viewed as bad, it's bad. But there is a concern sometimes where it's like, can you reliably illustrate or like create something representing something else, especially if the creator themselves hasn't been through it, right?
Right.
I think it's even different. Like it might be different than like, let's say like a World War II veteran writes a book on World War II, like their experiences, right? Like that is like a direct firsthand account of their interaction with that. But if you're someone who hasn't even gone through that, and then you're writing a piece of literature, or you're creating a movie based off of that, and then the audience is then getting like a third-hand removed interpretation of like an event, which is, I don't know if you could ever fix that issue. Or
I tend to agree with your take on this. It's like, I think that's probably an issue that you can't entirely fix. I think the best we can do is that artists should be cautious about depicting things that they don't know firsthand, but that doesn't mean they should never do it. It's just, you know, do it with some reservations.
Yeah, I mean, I think, at least for me, and like some of the topics I'm interested in, there has always been a thing in the back of my mind, like you should probably have more firsthand experience with this thing, or like try to get as close as you can. But it's definitely a little tricky with like more intense media, or like more very specific media like this. There's like, I don't even know how you would get acquainted with like, especially when you're like talking or making stuff about time periods that we're completely out of now, like that are just no one has experiences now, or like all you have are second-hand or third-hand accounts of a situation, because then it's just like, at that point it's just, well, just make it, and then, you know, everyone will do their critique and you'll get valuable insights off of that. But
our friend Nick is in chat, and he says, well, isn't classical music kind of depicting a period in time which you aren't connected to? And I think there's some truth to that, like a little bit. It has a pretty strong cultural association with times that we aren't part of. Like, I don't think it's explicitly depicting that, but I do think that when people hear classical music, it's not surprising to me at all if they're thinking about the time period when it came from. So I'll give that one like half credit.
Yeah, I think it's associated with that time period because it was made during that time period. But particularly on the fact that like, it, at least the way I'm thinking about it, it's kind of hard to layer that on top of, there probably are some like musical theory stuff that I just don't have the knowledge about, but it seems hard, especially without like lyrical components of songs, to like really pin that on like it's trying to represent this part of like time.
Right.
But like even like back then with instruments, I'm sure there are instrumentals that composers used at that time to like represent earlier movements or something like that too, even if they're not one for one recreations or anything like that.
Right. With music, it's a little bit of an interesting case compared to like a painting, for example, because we have surviving paintings that are hundreds of years old. With music, we don't have recordings of the performances from hundreds of years ago. We instead just have instructions on how to do the performances that as if they were from hundreds of years ago, and we'll never really be able to replicate it exactly. All we can do is follow the instructions, record the results of that, and that's what you're listening to. And, you know, it's like as if we were trying to paint replicas of the Mona Lisa from a description of it, it would just never be quite like the original. But
Yeah, and then it's like you can get into like really really minute details, right? Like, well, even if we perfectly played it note for note, like, are the instruments made of the same materials that would have produced like the same vibrations at like that place where they performed it at that time? It's like there's a bunch of stuff that you get into.
yeah, like the tuning of instruments wasn't even standardized in the way it is now until the late 1800s. But how much do you think this kind of thing applies to war media, right? Like if we're watching some movie about a war in ancient Rome, obviously we're very far removed from that.
Yeah, I mean, with the further you go back and like looking at historical sources, like even the further you go back, the more removed even like the primary sources are, or like when you're reading about like ancient Greek history or whatever, or like, you know, famous battles, a lot of it is like you're trusting this one guy who like you're hoping got his source from a person that existed and isn't just like making something up, and you can kind of vaguely tell that it tracks onto something. Like the further you go back, obviously the more difficult it is. But I think when you were talking about like well documented, quote unquote well documented historical events, I think the more responsibility you probably have. But there's definitely a lot of room for interpretation when it comes to much older like, you know, historical representations of things. But
right, so I think any depiction of a war in media is going to be mythologized to some extent. But, you know, if we're talking about the Iliad, we have only the mythology. We have no primary source on it, right? But
you're just like, I hope this somewhat tracks on, or I can try my best. And then it's like, are you being faithful to like the source that you're using, or are you trying to be faithful to the thing that the source is reporting? You get into like a lot of weird I keep saying weird, but you get into a lot of tricky traps of like what you're actually trying to represent. And it's like the best you can do is honestly just like try to go off the source that like you have. But then you would have to take with it all the flaws that the source might have and like all the information you're getting. So it's a tricky balance to pull off. But
how important do you think it is to represent war accurately?
It depends on the movie, or it depends on like the type of media you're doing. I think like the disclaimer is that no movie is ever going to 100% be depicted accurately, right? I think if like we look at a movie like All Quiet on the Western Front, the remake that got released last year, I think it does a pretty good job from what I know of the First World War. But even then there are like just some like minor technical issues or something, right? I think I always want to give filmmakers the benefit of the doubt, because they are not the ones who are choosing movies to be such like a big cultural influence on people's perceptions of past events, but they kind of just practically are. So on one end I'm understanding, and on the other end I'm like, oh, you should have done more research or something. Like, and then there's like different like things of what you would call accurate. Like, is the experience that like the character is going through within the movie accurate to like what people might have gone through? And that even if like the technical details are off, like the Saving Private Ryan beach, like Omaha beach scene, storming the beach, is like one of the greatest. It's obviously claimed as one of the greatest like war movies and then war scenes of all time. And when it came out, like there were people that were like, yeah, that's how it felt when you were there. But historians obviously go over it and they're like, well, this technical thing is off. Like the beach is way too short. It should be like a lot further in. You have like these little defensive things that the Germans put up, and they're actually in the opposite direction that they should be in. But it gets across like an emotion accurately. It's a weird way to describe emotions, but I think that's what people try to aim for a lot of the time. And I feel like that is a bar that like movies can set, or movies should strive for. And then to me, at least, on my order of priorities, unless it's something absurd, right? Unless it's like, this just didn't historically happen, or like this character just didn't exist in that environment. Like, I think like technical details are like a close runner up to the first one.
I would have thought they were a lot less important.
Really?
Yeah, because something like if you're saying like the barricades on the beach in Saving Private Ryan are facing the wrong direction, it's like, okay, that's an interesting fact that that people who are really into history might care about. I think like 99.5% of the audience is never going to know that or notice it or care about it or even have any reason to care about it other than just like what I think what they care about is the experiences of the characters and what's important to them, and it's just I don't know that.
For like a broad audience, I would probably agree with you. But for me personally, that's where I would put it.
Oh, okay.
I think there is certainly like some debate to be had on like specific mistakes or like specific details that are off. I guess my concern would be like if that happens enough in like the aggregate of the movie, like are you then like going into some territory where it's not very well representative of something, right? Because to me it feels like sometimes there might be enough technical errors to where like, oh, this just doesn't represent this like era well, even if it's getting across like a broader emotion well. And those are two different things, I think. Like it's hard to separate them, but like our impression of an era versus like the technical details of like a film building up to that impression, I think are different things. But it's kind of, I don't know if that makes sense.
I think so. And you know what? Like it seems like this applies differently to different historical eras because like I'm trying to think like people seem to want to make very serious depictions of anything from like maybe the mid 1800s forward if they're doing war films, and anything older than that they seem to take quite a lot of license to dramatize it.
Or unless they do like outright parody of something. Like I think like Jojo Rabbit was an example of that, right? Like it's a movie about living in like Nazi Germany during World War II, but it's obviously like extremely outlandish, and like certain aspects of it like are parodied to the point where it's like this isn't representative of like that time period.
I guess there's stuff like Mouse also. It's this like famous graphic novel about surviving through the Holocaust, but the characters are all like cartoon animals. But
so it's like there can be movies that are extremely accurate but don't leave audience members with like an emotional thing that would be considered like meaningful, and then there are a lot of movies that get things wrong that do leave people with the impression that like you would want them to have like at that time period. So it's always like balancing
it's like
those two things.
It's like how much is this a documentary versus how much is this storytelling, right? Like because I think if you're doing a documentary, then I would say, well, now you really should try to get the technical details right as much as you should, as much as you can. If you're doing a primarily storytelling exercise that just happens to be put in a historical time and place because it suits the drama of the story or something, then maybe it's a different
from my artist perspective, I would always give the director leeway there. Like if you think this is going to tell a better story, like unless it's going to break the setting that you have, like you should probably just take it. And then historians and pop culture historians can go in there and make all their critiques after, and people can know that way, which seems to be a growing popular genre on YouTube of historians talking about movies and then like kind of fact checking them. So
you know what? I bet this video is probably going to go on to say like half the stuff we just said.
Yeah, so
it's okay.
I'll let it play a little more. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Before we get into our more specific discussion of war films, we first have to have some understanding of war itself. We have to understand why, over the course of human history, we seem so eager to engage in deadly conflict with each other. Why the soldiers that are sent into these battles, despite knowing the horrors they will face, seem so willing to put themselves in harm's way. And why heroic causes so easily result in atrocities.
This great evil, where's it come from? What seed, what root did it grow from?
In his book Escape from Evil, Ernest Becker makes an attempt to uncover the roots of human evil and our appetite for war and destruction. He does so by building on the thesis he laid out in his Pulitzer Prize-winning book The Denial of Death, which argues that our primary driving force is the desire to escape death. Like all other animals, human beings have an innate fear of dying, but unlike animals, we are constantly aware of this inevitable fate. And because we know we cannot escape it literally, we attempt to do so symbolically.
You ask yourself what the sum total of your life represents. What difference your being there at any time made to anything. Or if it made any difference at all, really.
The classic and most obvious example of how we try to do this is through religion, which promises some kind of continuation of life after our physical death, be it via heaven, hell, or reincarnation. But Becker argues that it is actually the entirety of human culture that functions this way, as culture provides us with the opportunity to fit ourselves into a greater whole that gives our lives meaning, into some larger social construct that endures after we're gone, like a nation or an ideology.
I'm very proud to serve my country, yeah.
More specifically, cultures provide us with meaningful actions and virtues, which, through their realization, allow us to symbolically transcend death, to expand our lives beyond our physical existence. In simple terms, cultures provide heroism. Historically, heroes have always had an important role and function. As Becker writes, he is the one who gambles with his very life and successfully defies death, and men follow him and eventually worship his memory because he embodies the triumph over what they fear most, extinction and death.
You want to live? Get off the beach!
And nowhere is this more obvious than in war. Among the chaos, death, and destruction of warfare, the hero stands out as a life-affirming force, and their presence alone encourages people that they too can be victorious over death, even though death is staring them right in the face.
Can we pause for a second here?
Yeah.
A good example of this can be found in
I'm reminded of this conversation you and I had maybe like a week or two ago, where we were, we were talking about like how the ubiquitous the fear of death is, and then how like a lot of the stuff that people do is they're just, it's like copium basically, right?
Yeah.
And I think we were talking about the example of like monks who like dedicate their lives to overcoming the fear of death, and it seems to me like they're describing soldiers in almost that same way. It's like this is so life affirming because of how close to death it is.
Yeah, there's a there's obviously a lot of human psychology that needs to be unpacked there. I think I think the case for that, like, society creates like these like hero structures that we like try to fit ourselves into and then like prove our worth on is accurate. I think a lot of the people trying to walk the tightrope of like doing something extraordinary while like either defying death or like grave consequences is true, but I think people probably don't engage with it on that deep of a level. They're probably engaging with it as in on like less of the they're engaging with it on the hero structure, sure. Like, this person did this great thing and I want to be like that person because they're great, but I don't necessarily know if they're like, this person did this great thing and it's great because of X, Y, and Z reasons. And so I want to match that and like our hero structure. I don't think people engage with it that way. I think people engage with it the first way, where it's kind of like a cultural meme that they insert themselves into and then they want to like propagate, like, again, that they're not necessarily thinking about it like more of like a meta level like that.
Yeah, that sounds basically right to me. It's like, I think they basically have some ideal or some virtue that they want to embody, and then they just think like, this thing is so important that I should be willing to die for it, and now I had better go prove it.
Yeah. I think that I kind of disagreed. Like, there seems to be a little bit of an assumption at the beginning of this section of like, isn't it kind of crazy that like people go into these situations like knowing they're going to die and like they do it anyway? And it's like,
not really.
Some do, for sure. Like, I do know of some people, like whether I listen to podcasts or read books about them, where like they legitimately are like, these are my values and I'm going to go stand for them, and I know I'm going to die, but I'm going to do it anyway. And they are cognizant of like that decision. And then obviously this changes between conflicts, right? Like, you have conflicts where the military is involved in professional armies. So all the soldiers decided they wanted to join the military, and we could get into a whole like, well, there's certain pressures that force people in the joint, but that's a whole different conversation. And then there are other conflicts like World War II, where a large mass, the majority of the soldiers involved were not professional soldiers. They were like conscripted soldiers that were forced into the situation because either their government or, their government like basically needed and forced them to at like the third of like either imprisonment or jail time or something like that. Right. So I don't necessarily know if those people were, happy to be there or like were representing the hero system. But I'm guessing there's also probably like a lot of post hoc rationalization of like that behavior, right? Like to try to make some sense out of it, because like we are narrative seeking animals, right? Like we love narrative and we love doing that. So like if after like, oh, I didn't want to be there and it was confusing and I experienced a lot of stuff that I haven't necessarily like, come to deal with, there is narratives that we can like later insert that make sense or like try to make sense of things. Like, why did this person not die and this person didn't? Well, clearly they had like these qualities that made them do this way. But like in reality, the answer could just be like, well, maybe a guy like missed shooting at him by like, a couple inches and the bullet missed, right? Like there's so many things, but I feel like as humans, we try to rationalize that later on.
Yeah, and if we do that after the fact, maybe that's where the narratives come from that feed into the next war, right? But yeah. I think you made a good point like a couple minutes ago when you were saying like we probably shouldn't talk about war as if every single soldier is highly ideologically motivated, because most of them are probably not. Like that might be the kind of the most hardcore element of what goes on in the military. But it's neither the soldiers nor the leadership are probably like 100% bought in on all levels to whatever thing it is that they're trying to fight for, whether it's their country. It's like
a abstract amalgamation of like everyone's motivations of varying degrees of intensity or depth with that like specific like thing that is like causing them to like start conflict or something or engage in conflict. So it's like it's hard to pick it out and be like, well, this is the reason this happened, or this is at some point, obviously this is why we have leaders. At some point they do have to take responsibility for like certain decisions, right? Like and we do need to lay blame or I guess praise upon certain people for that, right, if they are in a leadership position. But I think broadly, like people are not engaging with these things, and then like you have to like ask even further, like, well, what defines like proper engagement with it, right? Like there might be some people who like are ideologically motivated, right? Easy example is like let's take like a German soldier in World War II. Like they might be ideologically motivated, but how are they engaging with like the ideology of like Nazism, right? It could be a very surface level engagement with it, but they could also be like a very zealous supporter of it, right? But they're just not engaging with it as like, I don't know, like some of the more like philosophical members of that party were. So it's like it's always hard to kind of scale like how intense people are feeling about something.
Yeah, it's just I think to get somebody into the right state of mind that they're going to go out and be killing people on a battlefield, I think they have to not just be highly engaged in the I guess I'm talking about like only the subset of people who are really like ideologically motivated. I think just being ideologically motivated is not enough. They also have to believe that there's some kind of danger or threat to their ideology that they're trying to fight off.
Yeah. And then obviously when you like broaden it out to like the national level, there are other things that come into focus, right? Like I know in the latter half of World War II, when the Soviets are pushing the Germans out of the USSR, you have a lot of countries that initially participated in the invasion of the USSR, but you had a lot of the population that didn't necessarily believe in like Nazism or like their fascist governments were like, but we don't want the communists here. Like we don't want the Soviets here.
Right.
So they're fighting for that reason. So like, then you then have to break that down even further. Like people are fighting for a bunch of different things, even if like the outcome is like a singular outcome, but you have a bunch of different motivating factors of like all the people involved.
Yeah, another thing that's really hard to disentangle from all of this is like how much is this actually just human like bloodlust and aggression finding an outlet through war.
Yeah. And I have heard that theory before.
I think that must be at least part of it, right? And it seems, and like when we watch war films, some amount of it really is just like action scenes and gore porn and stuff, right? So
yeah,
I don't know.
it's hard to I have heard the theory before that like there are just like certain human behaviors that like when not let out properly like build up into like some type of like fever pitch so where like a climactic event happens. So I've heard that theory or like mindset thrown around by some people, but I don't it obviously could be and probably is a factor, but I have no idea like how much it's interacting with like all the other things. But
Yeah, I don't know. It's really hard to say. Like, I mean, I'm not sure about the thing where it like builds up. I mean, that sounds plausible, but to me, but it also sounds plausible to me that maybe there's just some kind of latent aggression in most people, and that's just a well that they can draw on whenever the event happens to fuel into what whatever ideological thing is going on. So yeah.
In an episode of Band of Brothers in which the Allied forces attack the town of Kwai. As they are charging the snowy fields, one of the captains suffers a mental breakdown which causes the entire mission to stumble. The captain is then relieved by a more heroic one.
Alright, I want mortars and grenade launchers on that building till it's gone. When it's gone, I want first to go straight in. Forget going around. Everybody else follow me. Yes, sir.
One whose decisiveness and courage immediately embolden everyone around him. To top it off, he pulls off a truly death-defying stunt by running right through enemy lines to connect with the rest of his men stuck on the other side, all of which to the great admiration of his followers. By understanding cultural systems as hero systems, we can begin to understand why people are so willing to sacrifice themselves for their country or their beliefs. For in such a social structure, the sacrifice of one's physical being is but a small price to achieve symbolic immortality, to become a hero for eternity. But as the renowned psychoanalyst Otto Rank pointed out, there is something paradoxical about hero systems emerging in reaction to our desire to escape death, as it primarily seemed to have resulted in us becoming more concerned with achieving immortality, rather than actually preserving our lives.
I was just protecting my guys. They were trying to kill our soldiers, and I'm willing to meet my creator and answer for every shot that I took.
I think one of the reasons why no one can seem to agree on whether or not the film American Sniper is pro or anti-war is because it captures this exact paradox. Because while the film does portray its main character in all his human fallibilities, and as someone who exists in a self-destructive hero system, at the same time it also indulges rather uncritically in his legendary hero status within that system.
That guy, the one they're calling the legend, he got like 24 confirmed kills.
Wow.
And delivers on the promise of symbolic immortality by the end. A film that more purposefully captures this paradox is The Bridge on the River Kwai. The story begins with British prisoners of war who are forced to build a bridge for their Japanese captors. In the face of such great adversity, the British officer pushes his men to find dignity and purpose in their work, a work that will transcend their harsh conditions, and the war as a whole.
One day the war will be over. I hope that the people who use this bridge in years to come will remember how it was built and who built it.
And while this may have begun as a means of coping with their situation, gradually it becomes clear that for the officer, the building of the bridge becomes a microcosm of an immortality project, of a source for a heroic victory over death. He becomes so attached to his heroic goal that when a group of soldiers sneak into the camp to blow up the bridge, he has become too deluded to recognize them as his allies, and attacks them instead.
Blow up the bridge! Yes, look out, there's no... No! Help!
The result is a tragedy for pretty much everyone involved, including the officer himself, who collapses onto the detonator and destroys the whole bridge anyways. Leaving us with the only sensible conclusion.
Madness. Madness.
Hero systems, however, are not just paradoxical, They are also, as we shall soon see, an important, if not the most important, driving force for human evil. And if we are to truly understand the potential for and meaning of anti-war films, we need to travel a bit further into this heart of darkness.
I think there's an interesting paradox there of like, well, if at least within like the structure that's being given, right? If humans want to like achieve these things as a way to like kind of escape their finite existence, there is a paradox of like, well, these things are going to get you killed. So at which point you're valuing the hero system over the actual physical like act of dying. It creates this paradox where it's like, I don't want to die, so I'm going to do this thing that might kill me, but then I might be like metaphorically immortal. But then that's leading me to like disregard my actual existence that I was concerned with in the first place.
Yeah, I think it was an interesting point to compare this to religion, right? And I think we could compare, we could say something about like religious martyrdom, for example, because if you're convinced that there is some afterlife that's more important than the life you're living today, then it does make sense that you might sacrifice your life for it. But if you believe that some heroic ideal, it can even if it's just metaphorical immortality, I think it's not hard to imagine that it could play the same kind of psychological role in motivating a person to overcome their fear of death because they just think this other thing is more important. And yeah, like you said, it's paradoxical. They end up sacrificing their life for a different kind of immortality that may not even be real.
Yeah, I was having this conversation with my girlfriend the other day, and it triggered like a bunch of existential crises. But we were talking about like the concept of dying, and I think that was the reason why I brought up that topic to you. Was it last week or recently? And it was yeah, like for me, a lot of the stuff does seem like a big cope, but if someone was like, oh yeah, there is a heaven and an afterlife, I immediately become much less concerned with like actually physically dying, because it's like, well then why would I care that much, right?
Right.
So if you are convinced that those things are, well, the first one would be like, you're convinced that like that concept does actually exist and there is an afterlife or something like that, and certain actions get you access to that thing. I think that makes sense within that framework. But there still is a, at least to me, it's a very like odd behavior to like risk your life, which is the most valuable thing you have, over something that might not even be like an actual concept or like things that exist in the world, right? It seems like I don't know if I can come up with like a sufficient explanation for why people buy into that. Or maybe they just don't engage with it that way. It just becomes like a kind of...
No, I mean, I think the value of their life becomes a way of demonstrating their devotion. If we're talking about the ideologically motivated type of people. And also they're risking not only their own lives, but they're participating in something that they know is going to have a bunch of death and destruction for everyone involved, right? Like you have to not just be willing to die, but you have to be willing to kill enemy soldiers and to stand side by side with your friends as they get killed, right? And I mean, maybe people aren't, I don't know how much people are thinking that through before they go into the military, but I'm sure they know that it is true regardless of
yeah, it seems like a very individual focused system rather than like a collective system of any kind. But it's almost like, well, everyone is treating it individually, and so if everyone believes it, it does kind of become like, in essence, like a collective way to like value certain things, even if like the focus is on the individual. Yeah.
Well, and I think you have to view the enemy as a collective as well, right? Because I think it's a lot easier to persuade someone to go kill Nazis than it is to go kill this specific Nazi that has this personal history and this family. If you're even thinking about a person on a level that might invoke some amount of sympathy, you probably can't push people as easily to go, destroy that person, right? It just like you have to think of them as like this person is part of a grand evil, and and that's more important than their individual life.
Yeah, like an abstract concept almost that like you're fighting against. It's not, you're not dealing with the real, you're dealing with like this almost like unnatural force of evil or something that's like perpetrating these things in the world.
Yeah.
I think an example that was given earlier in a different context was like having movies from like the main character's perspective shows like how limited your view into war is. It makes it feel a lot more real, but at the same time, it could make those threats feel more abstract. I know he brings up Dunkirk earlier, and you never even see like any Germans in the movie if they're not in airplanes, or if they're not like very blurred out in the background. And even the only time where you ever get vaguely close to a close up of one of the German soldiers, it's when the Tom Hardy, who plays one of the fighter pilots, gets captured at like the very end of the movie, and like even then it's focused on his face, and the German soldiers are like out of focus, like they're just kind of silhouettes in the background. Focusing it.
That can't be an accident, right? That has to be like they're purposely trying to make them seem like their humanity is distant or something like that, right?
Or like the characters are, and this is where we get into like, well, it's true on an individual level. It's true on an individual level that it probably does a lot of time feel like this like abstract danger is like coming to get you. That doesn't really make rhyme or reason as to like who dies or whatever, right? So it probably does feel that way a lot of the time from an individual. So like in order to fight against that, I think there does need to have some like dehumanization of like the enemy or like the entity that you're against, right? But hopefully on like a collective level, we don't treat it that way. But it makes absolute sense for individual to treat it that way, because that seems like the only way that they could really deal with it, or else they have to confront the fact that like every time I shoot at like an enemy soldier, they have a whole background that I don't know, or that I haven't empathized with, or that I'm not considering, right, when I'm taking a human life. So it's like, it almost seems like a necessary precondition to like be able to kill people, or you're going to burn out very quickly.
A couple of months ago, Flotrace and I were watching an American World War II film about Japan. And the way that they depicted the Japanese was like, I thought, very dehumanizing. I mean, well, maybe not all the way throughout the whole thing, right? Like they did have some fairly like value neutral descriptions of Japanese culture and stuff, but there was some stuff like the Japanese man does not think of himself as an individual. He just thinks of himself as part of the great nation of Japan. And if he dies, his family will not grieve for him, for they know he died for the great cause or something. It's like it comes very close to just saying, like, do not think of this person as a person with friends and family who care about them, because if you do that, you might not want to kill them.
Yeah, it's like you're fighting the Borg from Star Trek or something. Like it's just like this inhuman like entity that like it just like you don't have to feel bad for destroying, really, because it doesn't even have the qualities that you could empathize with. I mean, yeah, I like it's like from a practicality perspective, I understand why that route gets taken, especially like during wartime, I think. But obviously on a human level it's always a balance. Is like it on the human level, it is frustrating that like it almost seems necessary that like we have to have that type of interaction with other things when we engage with them in like a conflicting or like a conflict or anything.
Yeah, when this happens in sci-fi or fantasy movies or something, the enemies will be like orcs or robots or something like that, right? And I think when they're depicted that way, it's very easy for the audience to be sympathetic to the people who are trying to kill them. It's like, these are just mindless monsters with you know, they should just die, right? But then I mean, Lord of the Rings is kind of a war trilogy, right? And I think you know, the way that you have to think of war to go in and want to mass murder the enemy is as if they were orcs or robots. So, you know.
Speaking of orcs specifically, that is a nickname that the Ukrainians have given Russian soldiers within that conflict. If you go on Twitter and you see like pro-Ukrainian accounts or like military accounts, they'll call like the Russian soldiers like orcs or like other derogatory names. But orc sticks out because like orcs in Lord of the Rings or something that are like, and within the movies at least, the vibe that I picked up was like evil is like an intrinsic quality of their existence.
Yeah, they're
like
kind of
it's an immutable characteristic. You can't change it. Like they are just that way. So like even for that specific word, people in the real world do use it that way, as in like you cannot change these people. Like this is an intrinsic quality of them. Like
and therefore they must die. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the So, but let's go on to the next section.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, here we go. Nature View.
Nice. Pre-watched.
The reason that Becker is so intent on understanding cultural systems as hero systems, and subsequently questioning them in a highly critical manner, is because he argues they are intrinsically connected to human evil. To him, the great paradox of human existence is that our consciousness seemingly transcends our animal nature in an almost godlike fashion, while our body does not. Or, as he so eloquently puts it, man has an awareness of his own splendid uniqueness in that he sticks out of nature with a towering majesty, and yet he goes back into the ground a few feet in order to blindly and dumbly rot and disappear forever. And so, assuming that our main driving force is our desire to transcend death, and that hero systems are the primary vehicle for that transcendence, heroism also functions as a denial of our physical limitations and animal nature, which Becker described as the negative which is incompatible with the absolute values we're striving towards.
Enough out of it, soldier! Sergeant, I want you to arrange for the immediate transfer of this baby out of my regiment. I won't have other brave men contaminated by him.
In Jungian terms, it can be described as our shadow, as that part of ourselves that we fear, that we feel ashamed of, that we refuse to acknowledge.
Cowards in my army.
We already saw the presence of this denial in the functioning of heroism that inspires soldiers to boldly charge into deadly situations, and briefly makes them forget or ignore their own vulnerability.
All these guys, they know your name. They feel invincible with you up there. They're not. They are if they think they are.
But repression itself is not enough to fully deny our shadow. For what is repressed is still internal. It can still find its way back to the surface. And so what we see in hero systems, and this is where we get to the nature of evil, is that the shadow is projected outwards. As psychologist and psychoanalyst Eric Neumann explains, the shadow, which is in conflict with the acknowledged values, cannot be accepted as a negative part of one's own psyche and is therefore projected. That is, it is transferred to the outside world and experienced as an outside object. It is combated, punished, and exterminated as the alien out there, instead of being dealt with as one's own inner problem. To put it simply, hero systems lead to scapegoating.
This is what happens when a world dies. Foreigners swarm over our streets. Immigrants who don't care for the past, only for what they can grab.
Scapegoating has always been an effective tool to organize people under hero systems. Again, be they nations, religions, or ideologies. For the simple reason that it absolves individuals of their deepest struggles and unites them in the face of an external evil. An evil that not uncoincidentally represents precisely that which they seek to overcome. An evil that is now clear, tangible, and destroyable. One of the most infamous examples of this is Nazi Germany, on which Becker writes, Hitler's rise to power was based on his understanding of what people wanted and needed most of all, and so he promised them, above everything else, heroic victory over evil.
Only when you understand that, can you understand what Hitler meant to us. Because he said to us, lift your heads, be proud to be German. There are devils among us, communists, liberals, Jews, gypsies. Once these devils will be destroyed, your misery will be destroyed. It was the old story of the sacrificial lamb.
It is because of investigations into the nature of Nazi Germany, such as depicted here in Judgment at Nuremberg, that Hannah Arendt also spoke of the banality of evil, a term she coined in response to the post-war trial of Adolf Eichmann, a Nazi officer who, despite having committed horrible crimes against humanity, showed no evil intent and appeared, in her words, neither perverted nor sadistic, but terrifyingly normal. A man who was mostly concerned with advancing his career and following orders. The banality of evil then was coined to point out this thoughtlessness with which evil acts can be committed. In Becker's terminology, we could say a man like Eichmann was so indoctrinated by his hero system that he was oblivious to how it was driving him towards evil. Though Becker also argued that the banality of evil is not so passionless as Arendt claimed, as it is born out of our deeper desire to transcend death. Eichmann wanted to be liked by his superiors, but for Becker, this did not merely make him a mindless follower, but rather someone driven to be part of the heroic group within his hero system. The real significance of Arendt's report.
I think there's a lot there. A lot of it we kind of talked about before the section started. I think it was probably well put as like there are things that we don't necessarily consider about ourselves or things that we don't like about ourselves that we then like project or externalize onto like another group. When you brought up the going over the Japanese or the US propaganda movie involving the Japanese, like when you're talking about that, like at the back of my mind, I'm thinking like, well, the people making the movie are like, but of course this like doesn't apply to us, right? Like, right, of course it is. Yeah, of course it is the Japanese guy he doesn't have a family that will cry if he dies because that's his role in society is to die for the emperor and like that system, right? But we would never act that way. We don't have any types of similar values, and it is funny like because we clearly do things that are representative of that, but like to treat others like as if they're engaging in like this malfeasance of like participating in that type of system is like odd, especially when like our participation in like a very almost exactly the same system is like so apparent, right? Like you do want that on like some level, right? Because the government requires that in order to wage war, right? Like you do want individuals who would die for like an ideology or a country or like something that at least in their mind represents like the country they live in. But at the same time, we also chastise other groups for engaging in that same behavior. Like I think the citation of the mindset of certain people who participated in Nazi Germany during World War II. It's like a similar thing, right? Like, oh, it wasn't that like Hitler was like this guy who's like, you know, going to do all these things or whatever. It was like he gave us like a thing that we wanted to strive for and a system that we could work in. And then we did that, right? Because it felt good to be within that system and like get rewarded based on the system that was then like created, right?
And I think they have to give you a very selective view of what they're talking about in order for it to be psychologically compelling. Because if they were to just come to you and go, look, these people over there are acting as if they were a mindless evil horde, therefore we had better act like a mindless evil horde in order, because that's the only way we're going to beat them. Like that doesn't come across as like emotionally compelling, right? It has to be that you see yourself in stark contrast with your enemy, and because and like he was saying about in the video about the shadow concept from Jung, it makes sense that you if what you want people to do is go out and destroy something, right? It's going to assist you greatly in motivating them if they see that as an external thing that can be destroyed and not as like an intrinsic part of all of our humanity that you will never overcome, no matter how many Germans you kill.
There is I think funnily enough, the movie Starship Troopers kind of addresses this concept because the movie at least is very like fascist critical, right? Like there's a lot of aspects in that movie that address this. And one of the things is like, in order for like fascist governments like maintain power, there always needs to be like some type of outside like enemy. And I think it's not necessarily particular to fascist governments, but it's probably heightened. There needs to be some type of outward force that is like that needs to be destroyed, that has like certain qualities to it, but that you completely project and like yeah, you almost do repress like that shadow version of yourself in order to like manifest it in like this entity that can be destroyed, right? Because then dealing with it within your own society becomes a much harder, much more difficult problem to solve.
Yeah, so I was talking to a guy from Brazil maybe like a year ago, and they were living under Bolsonaro, right? And this guy's opinion was that Bolsonaro basically just is a fascist, and at first I was not convinced of this, but over the course of the conversation he did convince me this is probably pretty much true. And a lot of the way that he was describing Bolsonaro's media presence is that they depicted every societal issue as if it were a war. So they have like, a war on drugs, a war on crime, a war on this and that. And of course we do some of those same things in the United States. We've had a war on drugs and a war on poverty and so on. But it's this like militarized mindset as if these problems are just, abstract external, or not even abstract, as if they are concrete external evils that we can defeat by just going after the right people, and the rest of us are fine. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, within the US, like, even for like silly culture war stuff, right? What was the like old one from like the 90s and early 2000s? It was like the war on Christmas, right? The way that was framed. Like, it's like even like the silliest things like that are framed as like this existential conflict that like, what word are we going to use? We're going to use war, the term that means that like when people go, they literally kill each other, right? Like these things do get, I think, repressed and then projected onto. But a part of me understands that on a individual level, because we're all individuals. So like, that's the level that I can relate to. I think when we start talking about like collective systems or societies in general, it becomes a lot harder for me to like think about how that happens like in a collective, and like why there aren't checks on that happening. Like, it is kind of like the old thing of like, like, how could like a place like Nazi Germany exist, right, without there being like more like and obviously like there are facts about that time period that like clearly lay out how it happened.
Yeah,
I
think it's
on
not
a psychological level, it's like how could you even like, it just seems so bizarre. Like how did it get this far without some type of force like being like, this doesn't really make sense, right? Like that's always the like age old like struggle with that.
Yeah, but I think if you're talking about that case, I think it's not that there were no checks. I think it's that the checks failed.
Checks failed,
right? Yeah. I mean, there were people saying this doesn't make any sense. Let's not do this. Let's not go in this direction. And those people were shouted down by the larger, group of people who, I don't know.
Yeah, it's almost it does kind of feel like, especially when you come to like totalitarian societies, it is always viewed as like there's a conflict and then like this party or like this entity then like takes power and the other side is like destroyed, right? But in reality, it's more like these sides, even when the totalitarians or fascists or any government like takes power, there is always still like an underlying conflict there. And it's just like, well, they're edging out a bit more on top. So then like their directives like take priority. And like, it's scary because like all they need is just like a little more support or like 10% more power and like that dynamic in order to like enact these like obscenely like horrendous like actions, right? Like it almost makes it scarier. Yeah. And but I guess that is me projecting a little bit because I'm like, how do I even like, I can't even like think about it. It does seem like my brain's doing it already. It's like, it does seem like this like evil force that like, how does it even make sense? And it's like, well, in reality, it is just kind of like the collection of all these things happening. And like, you really only need like a little bit more power than like the other, like the opposing force in order to like enact like horrible actions that have like terrible consequences, right?
Yeah, and I think the way that the individual psychology kind of turns into this group dynamic is just that the individuals are aware that the group exists and they have a preference either for or against the group, and I think that's sufficient to create a movement.
Yeah, I think for me personally, I think like one of my biggest fears has always been like not being able to recognize when I'm like subconsciously like feeding into like a type of system like that. It's always like it almost does feel like how can you be aware of like something you're unaware of?
Yeah, well,
And like
you probably
it's always a process, yeah. But
I don't think you actually can avoid
Mhm.
feeding into a system like that, right? I mean, there are going to be larger societal movements and ideas and things that you're going to be contributing to, whether you like
Mhm.
it or not, right? So
Yeah.
it's a more matter of choosing which ones to lean towards rather than trying to avoid it altogether, I think.
Yeah, the best you can do is just kind of like try to remove yourself from your perspective and kind of try to approach it that way. But like even then, you can never you can never know what you don't know. Kind of, you're always kind of operating within the framework of your society or like the hero system that like your culture gives you a little bit.
Yeah, so maybe this is like a little bit too abstract the way I'm going to try to put this, but I think if you have like a broader system of considerations, like if you have more people that you care about, more ideas that you care about, then I think that's somewhat of a buffer against going super far with any one particular group mentality or idea so that one dominates and destroys lots of others, right?
No, that just makes sense. It acts as like a kind of check, right? Like, well, if I care about humans, right, and I have this broad category of like humans that I care about, if like my in group does something against another in group, even though like I might try to rationalize it or something, I do have a somewhat like overriding principle that it is coming into conflict with, that it's at least making me aware of, right? Like,
Yeah.
okay, like maybe like I understand that like my country has to go to war with X country, right? But like the fact that I have like that mindset going into it, it does maybe prevent me from enacting like certain actions that are even worse than like I would have to enact, right? Like it keeps in mind a sort of like universalist value that we give people or like a certain group or something.
So maybe what that's the check against is it's a check against the banality of evil mentality, right? Where we just kind of do destructive things, not even because we want to be destructive, but because we're just overlooking the harm it's doing.
Or like, yeah, or like we're just like so immersed in the system that we don't even like categorize that as like important to us. Like it's not even like a consideration. Like, oh yeah, well of course this is my job, I have to do it, and I don't even think of like what the job is, right? It's just when you're operating on like almost like a completely parallel structure, like doesn't even interact with like some of the considerations. But
And of Becker's concept of hero systems is that the emergence of evil is not tied to any specific people or to some malicious villainous attitude, but to greater social structures that envelop us and blind us to their implications. And we all exist in such structures that promise heroic victory to those on the inside, and makes evil into something external. After the Second World War, for example, there were many who believed that by achieving victory over the Nazis, we also achieved victory over the evil they represented, which unfortunately isn't the case. But it goes to show that there is a fine line between recognizing a real threat to oneself or a community, and using that threat to delude ourselves into believing that we can erase the shadow of our own light by violently putting out someone else's.
I just want to believe in what we're doing here.
Well, there's evil here. We've seen it.
Yeah, there's evil everywhere.
It's a delusion that often reveals itself through promises like, if only these threats are eliminated, our freedoms will be protected. If only these enemies are destroyed, we will bring honor and justice to our nation. If only we end this war, we will end them all.
Oh, can we pause again for a second?
Knowing all this, it is finally...
I feel like there's going to be this conflict when they're making anti-war films, like a conflict between the delivering the message versus like amplifying the reach of the film, right? And this is because if you want the film to appeal to a mass audience, you might do things like make the action scenes more spicy, or you might want to hire attractive actors or something like that, right?
Yeah.
And the more you do this kind of thing, you risk glamorizing the topic that you're talking about. And that's like a hard balance to strike if your thing is anti-war, right?
Yeah, like there, like the line between like romanticization, even if not intentional, but like romanticization, but the audience is engaging into something versus like just reporting or like just showing something happening is like you almost have like no control over it. I think the problem with like the anti-war thing is like almost comes into I'm going to use this word a lot, I guess, into conflict with like the way that narratives are set up, right? Like narratives, as long as we've told them, have to have conflict in them, even if it's like a very like, you know, minute one, or like it's a very exaggerated one. Like almost every narrative that I can think of, at least, like has conflict in it. So like war is like almost the ultimate form of conflict, I think. Like
I think this idea that narrative always has conflict in it, like, it's so familiar to all of us, but I think it says something about human psychology that the way we engage with narratives is to look for conflict in them. Like, that's the lens through which we find structure in narratives, is like everything has to be a fight. Right.
Like, okay, well, the characters in the normal world and they're living their life, and then you have an inciting incident, and then they have to go on a journey, and then there's a conflict, and then there's a climactic resolution of the conflict, and then they come back, and then like now they've achieved like hero status, basically. Like that's the hero's journey, which is like a pretty basic hero system, but like it's so powerful that like we see it used over and over and over and over and over again in media that it's like but it almost feels impossible to distance from. Like,
the reason it's powerful, though, is because I think humans are just very conflict-brained, right? Like that type of description of a narrative resonates a lot with people, and I think there may be lots and lots of other ways of analyzing a story that really don't necessarily look at it in terms of conflict, but that one is so entrenched and so resonant with people that it ends up being not only the dominant way that we analyze stories, but also the dominant way that stories are written, right? It's like when people make these stories in the first place, they think like, okay, what's the basic conflict? Like, this is just...
like, I'm trying to think, like, if like someone asked me to like write a story that like doesn't have any conflict in it, it would be like, I feel like it would almost just be like a descriptive list of things, like in order, right?
Well, this is what it sounds like when little kids tell you, like, it's like, oh, hey, little Johnny, like, what did you do today? And they're like, I did this, and I did this, and I did this, and I did this. And like our brain perceives that as just a totally unstructured mess, or like a list of things. It's like, oh, but that's because little Johnny's day didn't have a central conflict and a narrative climax and a resolution, or something. You know what I mean? But there's really no reason why that can't be a story. It's just like because any story really is just a series of things happening, and then the whole conflict thing is kind of just a structure that we impose on it. I mean, if you want to look at like stories in media that aren't centered around conflict, it's like, it's a stretch, right? I mean, it's so hard to find.
It really is. I can't think of anything off the top of my head. Yeah.
Okay, like this might be a terrible example, but like like a porn movie, right? It's like here's just a story of some people having sex, and it's like, it is a story, right? And it's not real. But
even then, like, you could describe like, well, there's like an inciting action, there's like a lead up, and then there's like a quite literal climax of the scene, and then like it's over, right? But I think it's almost still like applying itself onto that structure, even though it's something that you would never think of. Like,
right, but I think that's our brain being trained to apply that structure to every story that we come across, right? It's not that porn is intrinsically about conflict; it's that you can find conflict in any story, that because that's how we're so used to analyzing things, right?
Yeah, it's. I just don't know. Yeah, it almost feels like I'm like, I know too much information to like switch lenses at this point, or I'm just like, I don't know, if someone was like, hey, here's this new lens that doesn't involve conflict that you could analyze stories with. I don't even know if I would be able to use it, because I feel like my brain is already like trapped within that system of just like, well, I have to look for these things to like make sense out of it, or like give it structure or something.
Okay, well, what about this? What about, instead of giving up the conflict lens, what if we were to like say, like, we're going to use these two these two lenses simultaneously, right? Like we can do the whole conflict structure lens like on one axis, and then on another axis there's like a different structure to the story, right? And then we make this like multi-axis system. Because I think the point that I'm making is not that there's anything like necessarily wrong with analyzing stories in terms of a central conflict and stuff. It's more that we just seem to myopically focus on like that one particular thing at the expense of any other lens of analysis of narrative.
Yeah, I think there's my thing with always that thing is like if there's an established norm, it's almost necessary that like if you're making a critique off of it, it's built in contrast to that norm, which means it's almost like is equally informed by it as like the norm itself almost. That sometimes seems to happen. So it's like, even if we're like, well, here's a parallel structure through which we can do, and we're not getting rid of the conflict structure, but we're coming up with like a parallel one, it like almost is equally informed by the conflict structure that it's like trying to be in opposition against, right? Sometimes I think it's a problem with like analysis or category sometimes where like there's a pre-established norm and it's like almost any type of alternative structure you try to build in place of that is necessarily informed by the previous one. So almost it sometimes feels impossible to me, but I'm sure there's ways in which you could do it that would successfully convince me. But
yeah, I mean, this makes me wonder if there are like isolated cultural examples of like, you know, there's a tribe living on an island somewhere and then they have their own like lens of analysis of these things that doesn't particularly center around conflict. But, you know, if we heard their stories, we would look at it as like, this is all about this conflict, but those same people can hear the same story. And because they're not exposed to our like conflict brained way of analyzing stories, like I don't know if this is to what extent this is a cultural thing. It seems to be like a very broad thing across like most of humanity. It's just like I'm not even sure like is it so ingrained in humanity that like literally every group is doing this.
I feel like I'm in that space. I feel like it's impossible. I feel like it's almost like intrinsic to like just being a human. I think like conflict is just one of those things where it's just like a very base level like reptile brain just like function that happens, and like it's hard to remove yourself from it. Because like even like I'm trying to think like, and of course like I'm not going to be able to remove myself to like the context in which I exist in, but like even if I like try to conceptualize like, okay, let's say we go back before like literary analysis and like all this stuff, right? And I'm thinking of like there's cavemen and they're like, it's like, well, what's the conflict? It's like the conflict is that they have to like get food so they don't die, right? Like even that, like there is a conflict there that I would like structure onto, like that I would build a structure around that. Like even if you're there and you're living it out, it's like that is what you're concerned with. Like I need to go get this thing or else this thing won't happen.
Right.
And like it literally at that point involved like you having to go out and like kill something. Like it almost seems like impossible to escape that.
So like competition for resources or something is like the kind of underlying conflict there. Yeah. Well, anyway, like if our brains are so fixated on interpreting narrative in terms of conflict, then no wonder it is so easy to make these like hero-centered narratives that feed into war, right? It's like the whole like conflict element is built into the story. Just it might even be biologically built into the way we think about stories, and I mean, it seems like it must, if that's true, it must feed into this whole thing about how to motivate people to go to war with these narratives.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Time to take a more critical look at war films and zoom in on some particular aspects of hero systems and their specific representations in cinema. Hopefully, we will then get a better grip on what anti-war films can be and what they should aspire to. Even though what we've discussed so far is but a mere introduction to the work of Ernest Becker, and even less so to that of Hannah Arendt, I think it is enough to get a sense of the deeper dynamics of war and human evil that echo into the films we see about it. It also gives us a better context for the anti-war criteria listed in the introduction, and we can now point out how they can indeed be effective, but also how they have their limitations. The first criteria for an anti-war film was that they must show a realistic depiction of deadly combat. They must
Vels
provide
is
an honest
suggesting that
reflection
you
of
can
the
use the
acts of
spacebar to
violence committed
pause
during
videos.
war.
Oh yeah, it's just
With the essence
I
of
just have
hero
my
systems being that
I'm
war
keeping the
is
Discord
necessary to
on top of the
overcome
video,
evil,
so I have to
they
like click back on the
suffering and
window
death
to
are
use the
rewarded
spacebar
with
function.
honor. What is probably the greatest merit of realistic violence is that it emphasizes how few soldiers actually die a meaningful heroic death. It reminds you that there's a good chance you won't go out in a blaze of glory, but are more likely to die in some silly way before you've even gotten a chance to display any real heroism. Maybe you are hit the moment you step on the battlefield, maybe even before that. Maybe you're hit by friendly fire, or maybe you accidentally blow your own butt off by not carefully handling a grenade.
I blew my butt up! I blew my butt up!
A realistic depiction of violence also serves to show that even if you do survive a war, you probably won't feel like a hero. In fact, the impact of combat can be so traumatic that the toll it takes on your mental health can end up destroying exactly what you thought you'd protect, and leave you as a mere shell of your former self that's neither heroic, nor victorious over evil, nor death transcending.
War don't ennoble men, turns them into dogs.
What is important to remember is that in hero systems, violence and suffering can be redeemed as long as they serve a greater purpose. As Becker wrote, what man really fears is not so much extinction, but extinction with insignificance. And so when we're discussing the cinematic depiction of combat and trauma, this nuance is precisely the reason why many war films stumble in their message. One popular film that exemplifies this is Saving Private Ryan. The film opens with the invasion of Allied soldiers at Normandy. The 20-minute or so sequence, which is filmed in a realistic-looking documentary style, features graphic violence, terrified soldiers, and the overall chaos and destruction of combat.
Oh, can we pause again for a second?
Anishka Monet
I have a friend who's a horror writer, and I've had a bunch of discussions with him about like what makes the genre, what are the features of different fiction genres and what makes them what they are. And one of the things we were talking about was, I think the popular conception of horror is that it's just media that is scary or that is designed to be scary or something like that. And I think that's actually wrong though. And I think something like Saving Private Ryan is a very good illustration of why that's wrong, because this is a movie that is scary and it has gore and it has horrified people witnessing terrible things, and yet we all know it's not horror, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's all the qualities are there to have it be a horror movie, or like we can just look at like movies about like actual historical events that happen, right? Like you could watch like Schindler's List and like call it a horror movie, like because all the qualities are there for it to happen.
I actually don't think all the qualities are there in war movies for it to happen.
Well, they could be there. I don't know if they necessarily are there. But yeah, like the Saving Private Ryan, there's like gore. There's like terrifying things happening. The characters are clearly scared of what's happening.
Yeah.
Hopefully, as an audience member, maybe some of the audience members are probably horrified by what they're looking at.
Yeah.
There's like an anxiety aspect to it. There's a pacing aspect to it that's there. Like you could find similar things.
But what I think is missing is the mystery aspect, because they understand what the danger is that they're facing. There's no like crazy supernatural entity that they don't know how to deal with. And I think if you had a movie that was like Saving Private Ryan, except they're fighting an army of zombies instead, then it is going to be perceived as horror, just because zombies are perceived as this like mysterious supernatural thing that we don't know how to,
like it does seem like for a lot of horror, like as soon as you define like what the threat is, it like almost deflates a lot of it. Like like one of my favorite like horror movies is like The Shining, right? And like there's implications there that like maybe like the hotel is like itself haunted or like evil entity or stuff like that, but it never like strictly defines what it is.
Yeah, and the fact
like,
that you don't know is actually an
Yeah.
important part of it. Yeah.
It would be interesting to see a movie like a traditional war movie where they like introduce that aspect to it. I think the one thing that's probably tricky is that like with a lot of the classic like kind of horror movie concepts, like I think zombies is a good one. They become like so commonplace and like fleshed out like mythologically
they
within
stop being
media.
perceived as
They
a
are not
horror
scary
thing
anymore. Yeah, it's like
and then we get zombie action movies instead of zombie horror movies because they're no longer mysterious. Yeah,
it's like, oh, here are these zombies, and it's like, well, the character's like, oh, well, we know how to deal with them. They're very easy. You just shoot them in the head, and then it's over, right? Unless you give them some like other like type of quality to them, like it was an okay movie, but like if we look at like the World War Z movie and you see like the zombies like forming these like mass of like pyramid or like these mass human mounds like get over like the wall like surrounding Israel or whatever, it's like that is terrifying because that is like a unknown kind of inhuman aspect that hasn't been like fleshed out because it is this kind of like almost
they're doing
organic or like
they're doing something surprising that undercuts your sense of security, right? And that's what I think it is more. It's that I think horror is actually more about discomfort than it is about fear. It's about like there has to be something like unsettling about it and
like
not
disconcerting.
And in a war movie, I think like as many negative emotions as it evokes, I think this is why we don't think of them as horror, right? But even though we'll say phrases like the horror of war, but I think that is an analogy kind of, and not, well, I don't know.
Like at the end of the day, it's like you like when you're watching World War II movies, for example, it's like the bad guys are the Nazis, like that, or the Japanese, depending on the theater you're examining, right? But like most of the time it's the Nazis, right? And like these are like a very clearly tangible bad thing that like existed that we can like map onto and be like, this is like why these. And like on an individual level, I'm sure the experience can be almost like horror like because like you're experiencing it on an individual level, right?
Yeah.
Like if you're like in a trench somewhere and like artillery shells are coming down on you, you're not thinking like, oh, there's a person on the other end firing this thing and this is clearly defined for me. And like your brain, you're thinking like there's a bunch of random things happening and I could die. So like on an individual level that is, but when you're removed from it and you're watching it through media, it's almost like impossible to capture that because like the movie itself is framing it in a way where like these are tangible things that like you understand that are causing this to happen.
Vels says, I feel like this is really clear in creature features where the monster is unseen and unknown. Once you get a clear view of the monster, no matter how scary or well portrayed, it is never as scary as what it could have been. Fear of the unknown and all that. And I think like another good example of this is, I don't know how familiar you are with H.P. Lovecraft, right? But his whole big thing was fear of the unknown, and he would basically just. He had some famous quote. I'm unfortunately not going to be able to remember it exactly, but it was something like fear of the unknown is like the deepest and most prevalent human fear. Obviously that disagrees with something said in this video where they said fear of death, right? But
well, I don't know if it necessarily disagrees. Well,
because I think
it can be, but like
I think Lovecraft would see the fear of death as like a subset of fear of the unknown.
Yeah, that's probably what I would, depending on the person, right? It's like I said earlier, like if I died, but I knew there was like an afterlife after that I go to, well, death is suddenly not scary anymore.
Right.
But for me personally, it's like the fact that like I don't know what death is like. It's like this abstract concept that I can't even wrap my head around is like what's terrifying about it. But if it's like, oh, you become a ghost, or like, oh, well, it's just this way. It's like, well, you just don't know. So that's why it is terrifying, at least to me, right? And I'm sure it's a lot of people.
I guess,
and almost the hero structure that they're talking about in the video almost does do that thing where it's like, here's death, and then like here's a way to like substitute that fear with something else to where it makes sense almost. So it almost like lessens that fear response that people might have to death otherwise, right? Like, I'm gonna do this thing, and this is gonna make me like quote unquote like immortal within like this context, and it almost removes some of that unknown fear factor to like well, like the concept of death. It makes people do things that they otherwise wouldn't if death was just like this abstract concept that they can't understand at all.
Mm-hmm. I think you made a good point about the kind of the way that the point of view of the observer is in war movies, because I do think it would be really different to see a war movie from first person point of view rather than like an omniscient camera that's just giving some like battlefield overview of everything that's happening, right? Because from the, like you said, from the point of view of the participant, like it's gonna look a lot like just random violence, which I think is much scarier than the kind of like zoomed out view of two clashing forces, which just the very fact that it appears more orderly is like less scary.
Yeah, randomness is certainly a thing that makes almost anything more terrifying. The movie 1917 kind of does the first person perspective okay, because it's meant to simulate like if like the whole movie was one shot, so you stick with the same characters throughout the movie. But the way what the movie is structured around kind of relieves some of that. It's like they have to get from point A to point B to deliver a message, so like that kind of is the like overriding structure of the story. But like it kind of does a little bit get to a little bit of the randomness, because like if you're following this one character going through a bunch of things and like they're not necessarily sure they're going to encounter certain things, but like it does seem somewhat random like what they're encountering. But I think again, like, yeah, the overriding structure kind of does take away. Like it would be, I think the only way you really could get it is like if you did have that first person perspective and like you're given like minimal information. Like
have you seen Pan's Labyrinth?
I have seen Pan's Labyrinth.
Okay, to what degree do you think that's a war movie? Like, for anybody who hasn't seen it, it takes place during the Spanish Civil War. This girl is part of a family that's out there experiencing the horrors of war, but then she's like in this dissociated fantasy world while all of it's happening.
We're getting into like genre definition. It's like it's a war movie by the fact that like there's a war that is taking place within the movie. And like the themes like touch upon war, but like
I feel like the theme is actually really important to the movie, even like as little as it shows up explicitly.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's like an example of like good writing, right? They're getting across a message without having to rely on like the literary thing that's happening.
Yeah.
Or the literal thing that's happening.
Yeah.
You could say it. I wouldn't argue with someone if they said it was a war movie. But I feel like colloquially, when we use the term war movie, I feel like everyone kind of knows what we're talking about. And I don't think the first example like the average person would give is like, oh yeah, like Pan's Labyrinth.
Right.
It would be like, oh, like Saving Private Ryan or American Sniper or Lone Survivor or like any of these other types of war movies that you think are Behind Enemy Lines or something, or Apocalypse Now. Like that, I feel like those are the things that they're usually more literal when people talk about them. Kind of like the way that people talk about horror movies. It's like, well, what's a horror movie? Well, it has a monster in it, or there's ghosts, or there's zombies in it, and it's like, well,
that's a horror aesthetic. That's not.
That's the horror aesthetic. Yeah. In the same way that like war can be an aesthetic, but
but I think Pan's Labyrinth might just be a war movie without the war aesthetic. Because, and I thought it was an interesting example of a movie that's mostly following one character's point of view, and there's a lot of like mysterious, weird, scary stuff happening, almost as if it were.
It's like a substitute. Yeah. It's like a metaphorical representation of that. The tricky part with Pan's Labyrinth, I think, is that when you get into metaphorical representations of things, it is easy to turn it into, ironically enough, into like an external concept that like you're dealing with, right? Like, oh, why is this bad stuff happening? Well, there's like a bad creature, right? That's meant to represent this thing. And so like it is an external force that like you're dealing with.
It's doing the thing that this video talked about where you're like externalizing the internal conflict or whatever.
Yeah, in a way. And typically, like, I think underlying the whole conversation, I think there's a thing of like, whether these things are good or bad. And it's like, I think it's really hard to nail down. Like, there's some clear examples of like, this is bad, we should not do this most of the time. Or like, the majority of the time, this is like, dehumanizing people is probably bad most of the time. But when you really start like sinking your teeth into like the topics, it becomes like a lot murkier over like, well, like what should we like, what is like purely descriptive, and then like what are prescriptions based off of that becomes like really hard once you start getting into like the nuances of like this topic, because you can only exist within like the framework that you're given, much like the video states. So it's hard to like make prescriptions outside of that environment. It's like, it's kind of like, it's kind of like, well, we should hold universalist values. It's like, okay, but the world operates on the level of like the individual nation states within it. And it's like, well, you can have ideals that you hold, but like practically, like you're going to engage with it as if you're like part of that system. So it's like, it's hard to say like, this thing is bad, you should not do this, but also we need to do these things. It's like, it's
yeah. Well, we don't have a universalist point of view, right? And any universalist values we ever figure out are going to be pieced together from the more particular points of view that we have. So it's just not something that I think comes naturally to us, or not easily anyway.
Yeah, I don't think individuals are necessarily capable of that, but
Explains in her essay, Is There Such a Thing as an Anti-War Film? The conventions of Hollywood storytelling re-emerge and ultimately frame the violence and the cost of human life as heroic, and renders it all meaningful. This is most notably demonstrated as our main hero falls at the end, which could have left us wondering if the sacrifice to save Private Ryan was worth it or not. But instead, the film provides us with a clear answer with its epilogue, in which Ryan lives to be a good man and beloved grandfather, who remembers and honors the men who died for his sake. In doing so, we are reassured that all is well, that all these sacrifices eventually served a heroic purpose, and death has successfully been transcended to achieve greater significance.
Someday we might look back on this and decide that Saving Private Ryan was the one decent thing we were able to pull out of this whole god-awful shitty mess.
To emphasize, this doesn't make Saving Private Ryan a bad film, but it does make it a comfortable one. And as such, it greatly detracts from its effectiveness as a true anti-war statement. In his review, David Walsh also draws attention to the film's heroic leaders. The implicit stance taken by the film, he writes, is that only the authorities in Washington concerned themselves with ideological matters, while the men in the field were unthinkingly doing the dirty work. By looking closer at the representatives of what we could see as the film's hero system, we indeed see they are portrayed as righteous, rational, and deeply concerned with the suffering of soldiers and their loved ones. The point is not so much if leaders were actually like this or not, but that it doesn't at all question the hero system that is driving the violence. The film states the sacrifices were costly, but then assures us they were laid upon the altar of freedom. And this sentiment of meaningful suffering echoes throughout the entire film, and in doing so, redeems it. What it comes down to is that despite showing the gritty reality of combat, war films can still romanticize instead of criticize if they do not question the general function of their hero systems. And so, in our effort to explore the potential for true anti-war statements, let's examine if this can be done better. The second important criteria for anti-war films was that they have to show both sides of the conflict, which Clint Eastwood took pretty literally by making two films on the Battle of Iwo Jima, one from the perspective of the Americans and one from the perspective of the Japanese.
Vels says he doesn't think that's true about Saving Private Ryan. He says that seems like a really lazy assumption on the part of the video maker. I've seen Saving Private Ryan, but it's been a really long time. I mean, do you think it's true that Saving Right. I assume what Vels is talking about is the video asserted that the film fails to question the hero narrative that's driving the war. I think that's probably what he means. I don't know. What do you think?
I think it's kind of, I'm gonna have to like address like the context of the media rather than just like the text itself. It's like when you do watch, I'm pretty sure they do it a few times in Saving Private Ryan, where like the characters will like openly complain about the fact that they have to be there fighting a war.
Uh-huh.
In the TV miniseries Band of Brothers, which is also set during World War II, that's definitely a theme that comes up a lot of times. Like the characters are frustrated that they like even have to be there. There's a scene where it's like right after, I forget after what date it's in, but it's in 1944 or early 45, I believe. And a huge German army like surrendered, and they're like marching down this road, and the Americans are advancing, passing by it. And like one of the GIs in the truck like starts yelling at the German soldiers, and like he's kind of just riffing on them at first, but then it turns on like a very clear, like genuine expression of like frustration. And I think the exact quote is like, what, like, why the fuck do we even have to be here? It's because of like assholes like you or something like that, right? And he's like insulting them, and the other people are kind of like, okay, whatever, like knock it off. And I think that can work when like talking about the specific characters within the text, but I think the specific event of World War II, as we've talked about off stream, has like been so mythologized to the point where it's like, even if the movie makes any statements like that, the implicit assumption is that it is worth it, because like we basically destroyed like our representation of evil in like the modern era, right? Like it's almost impossible to get away from. Like even if characters like riff on the fact like I don't want to be here, whatever, like in our minds as the audience members, it's like the Nazis are pretty much the ultimate like touchstone of evil that we have, at least in like modern times. So like it almost is always implicitly like the World War II was worth the struggle. I think it gets a lot murkier when you start going into like different conflicts. But with Saving Private Ryan specifically, they do make meaning out of the fact that like it's not necessarily about fighting the entire war. It's about saving this one guy, because like that's what they get meaning out of. But even outside of that, the audience can be comfortable with the fact that like World War II is viewed as like a good war that was absolutely needed to be fought, right? So I think maybe in another movie set in a different time period, I probably wouldn't. I think it's easier to do that, but with World War II movies, I think it's particularly difficult to like get that across to the audience.
We might need to get
like,
another generation or two removed from it before we could have that kind of point of view on World War II, right? Because
we have that with. We sort of implicitly have that with the war the big war before that, which is World War I. I think it's often viewed in people's minds as like unnecessary. There wasn't any clear meaning derived from it. The conflicts aren't really clear. Like the governments that existed at that time period either are extremely different now or just like no longer exist. The culture was different, stuff like that. And it is relatively like recent, like it's 100 years, it's like a little over 100 years ago. But
I think
wars before that, we inject like, current morality into too. Like we could look at like the Civil War, like the Revolutionary War in the US, right? And these are wars that happened before that, but we view them with like almost similar aspects to like World War II, right? Especially if you're an American, almost only if you're an American.
Yeah.
So I think it does depend on like the conflict that you're talking about. I don't know if it necessarily has to do with distance. Distance is probably a big factor, right? Like no one really cares about like, oh, well, the Romans did this conquest and like, in like this time period, and we're like, we feel very morally strongly about it. So
yeah, that's not really part of our like cultural mythology in the same way as the ones that you name. Like like us living in the United States, we have the American Revolution, the Civil War, and World War II are a really big part of our cultural mythology.
Yeah.
And I think World War I just kind of isn't. And so like we're not conditioned to have the kind of emotional response to it that we are to World War II. You know, it just seems like the emotional response is, well, a bunch of people killed each other for no good reason, and then 20 years later, like, and and it was the setup for the real bad thing that happened 20 years later.
And then even with like lesser studied wars, I just feel like there's like a certain exposure to it, right? Like I feel like if you poll Americans on like what are the thoughts on the Korean War, it's probably a lot more complicated for like people just don't have a great idea of like how to inject the systems like our World War II morality systems onto that conflict, because it becomes a lot more complicated, especially during the Cold War, right? You see this become like increasingly difficult to where like in real time, while those conflicts were happening, there was like debate over it, right? Like Vietnam is a great example of like, while that conflict was currently going on, it was challenging like the American morality system of like, well, we're the good guys and we're fighting the evil bad guys. Like there was deconstruction that was happening. But with World War II specifically, I feel like I'm just not sure. I can't like it's almost like so ingrained into like everyday culture in ways that people don't even think about, that it's like impossible to distance from almost. Like
Vels says, so Saving Private Ryan ties it up with a bow at the end, that Ryan was a good man and had a family, etc., but that doesn't necessarily make it worth it. They lost men saving Ryan. What about the families that they would have had? That is also in the movie. It just seems like a really lazy interpretation of the movie to take the end scene as the be-all and end-all message of the film, or what it has to say about war.
I feel like that might be like there might just be like a personal like inference, like the disagreement that we're having there. I think you probably could interpret it that way. But I think the fact that like those questions are raised within the movie, like the squad mates in Saving Private Ryan bring it up as a conflict. Like, why do we have to go die to save this one kid or whatever, right? Like that's a conflict. That's questions that the characters field in the movie, but the movie does wrap it up in a bow later. So I think like it's like heavily implied that like that was a payoff that like happened, right? That did make sense. Or that like it was worth it for that one thing. And I think even the characters that live to like the climax of the movie do kind of accept that reading of it too, because they do come around to it, or else they wouldn't have like followed through with it, I think. So the movie does, I think imply that, even though like it is brought up, and like I'm not going to discredit the movie to say it doesn't question its own motives, but I think the conclusion of the movie and the way the characters act in it in the end kind of do reinforce the fact that like there is intense suffering involved, but the suffering is like a heroic suffering that is worth it to achieve this goal in the end.
Yeah, and if that's true, then it does make a lot of sense with what this video is saying, where it's saying what people fear is extinction without significance or something like that, right? So then if at the end they have some they've found some significance to all the sacrifices that happened, it almost doesn't even become a calculation of was it worth it. It's just, well, we achieved something by dying, and I don't know. And that's sufficient to quell the fear.
Yeah, like I mentioned before, like there's like a post hoc rationalization that's happening of like, well, here's the suffering that happened. Let's try to find some meaning to get out of it, or else then it's just like this unexplainable thing that's happening, right? Like, maybe if the movie was like, if they show up and Private Ryan's dead, like the reason they go there, he's gone. Like maybe the unit they're trying to look for is like just not there, and they're like, oh shit, now we're just in this shitty situation. That probably would have been like a much better illustration of that point. But I do think the movie is a bit comfortable in that like it does kind of relieve the audience of like, well, you know, Saving Private Ryan got to live, so we're all good, and they beat the Nazis and everything, and like we're fine, and sacrifices were bad, but like, you know, we got the thing ultimately. I think if the movie was trying to do the opposite, there would have been much stronger ways to illustrate the point. So I tend to agree more with the video, the author of the video.
Okay.
But I don't think it has to be as literal as this.
History is full of wars, fought for 100 reasons. But this war, our war, I want to believe, I have to believe.
Vels compares it to Starship Troopers.
Becker wrote that all wars are holy wars, in the sense that they serve as revelations
kind of work, I guess,
as a testing of divine favor. and as a means to purge evil from the world at the same time. A hero system reinforces the belief that only its own followers are meant for heroic destiny, and scapegoats others to fuel its holy crusade towards that destiny. And so the value of showing both sides is that it helps to counteract scapegoating, to expose how those who are accused of embodying absolute evil are actually innocent, or misguided by their own hero system. Either way, it grants humanity to those who would otherwise be dehumanized.
You loved by all. Know that I was, too.
But this isn't always as easy as it may seem. It generally works well for conflicts that, assuming a Western/American perspective, are far removed from our own experiences, or for wars that are now generally condemned as having been terrible for everybody involved. But for conflicts that do hit closer to home, showing the other side often remains limited to only showing parts of the other side. Many films on the war against terror, for example, will often show American soldiers connecting to foreign families. In particular, they show them connecting with children, the almost universal symbols of innocence. The issue is that while this does help to counteract the mistaken belief that there are entirely savage nations or people, it doesn't give us much insight into the actual group that these soldiers are in conflict with, and therefore into the conflict as a whole. And when that group then ends up victimizing this now humanized other side, as often happens in these films, it only reinforces their assumed evilness and the righteousness of the war against them. Especially when it comes to harming children, this message can easily be twisted into one where, as Monette writes in her essay, the enemy is so perverse and cruel that they will harm even defenseless children, whereas our side protects them and tries to keep them safe. One important reason why I think it is so difficult to really portray and question another hero system is because it always reflects back on our own. If we are shown how others were driven to war and violence because of false beliefs, it suggests the possibility that we are too. Note that this doesn't mean that every hero system is equal, and that all acts of violence caused by it are the same. But it does mean that we are all susceptible to promises of heroic victory in the same way. And this can be an uncomfortable thought.
The tribunal is now in session.
Just to add on top of that, I think there's I think that's where, I think before we had the stream where we were talking offline, I think there is a thing to be said about if like you are portraying a group that like at some point it almost does become impossible to not portray them as like evil, I guess, or like it becomes so absurdly difficult that like it's like, well, we could try to humanize people that like will harm innocent children in like a war zone, right? Like you could do that, but like that almost gets to like a point where it's like it is almost not worth the effort to like go through that. It's like there is almost like no greater evil when it comes to humans, right? That like you're like murdering children like indiscriminately or something like that. I think that's one of my problems with the framing of anti-war movies is that like, well, there is a point to where like even if we take into account all of the perspectives, we can't say this thing is like uniquely and wholly bad, or like this group did like bad things. And like I can be empathetic and understand like maybe like you know how someone joined ISIS or ended up there, but like the acts upon which they're committing is like, well, one of the sides is the good guys. Like, and I can say like, well, within my perspective, sure, but like hopefully I would want that to be like a baseline for like almost all people to view that as like one side's good here, one side's perpetrating good, one side's perpetrating bad. I think it's there are examples of that where it's like I don't think it's necessary to be like, well, I don't necessarily think we need to illustrate like every perspective in a conflict if like one side of the conflict is so like evil, I think, which I think is loading a lot with that word, but you almost like haven't it. If there's a time to use it, there are certain groups that would fit that description, I think. But
So I'm guessing, we're talking about like probably Nazis, for example. Like is it basically just your take that like, yeah, maybe it actually is okay to depict them as evil? Like,
I mean, when we're coming to like particular, like it depends on like how big the group is and how broad the group is. I think when we're talking about like particular like the war on terror, like when you're talking about certain terrorist groups, I think it's like you're not necessarily. Sometimes there is nuance to be had there for sure. But I think like there is a limited scope there to we could be like the things this group or even like an individual is perpetrating is evil, right? Even if we are empathetic. And I think it's okay to frame it that way within the context of a narrative, right? Like if we're framing like, like the Ralph Fiennes' character and Schindler's List or whatever, like that is an evil character, even if we do humanize him. But I think like after that added layer of humanization and like empathizing with that character, I think it is okay to then layer the like label of like bad or extreme like evil like onto that character.
Well,
I think that's fine.
At minimum, this was very destructive, right?
This was very destructive, and like someone needed to do something about it that might or is a very well justified action to like kill this person, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and it seems like there's an inherent, at least from the section a little bit, it seems like there's an inherent dislike of that. But I think you can make a pretty solid case for like, I think it is okay for media to depict certain things as if like this thing was bad and it's good that we stopped this thing from happening.
Right. I mean, I wonder, if we were talking about media depictions of mass shooters or something, we probably wouldn't, like in some sense, it does make sense to humanize them if you want to understand them better. But nevertheless, it like they're doing a bad thing, and it's good that we stop them with violence if necessary.
Yeah. So it's always like, but when you do that, there is obviously like a heroic thing that like is happening within that context, right? Like it's almost impossible to divorce that. Like you're stopping someone from doing something really evil. Like, and it's not in like a complicated, like, well, there was a political conflict in Germany at the time and like not everybody was on board, but it was complicated. It was like this individual is doing a really bad thing and this person risked their life to stop that from happening.
Yeah.
It's like, even if we analyze and like remove ourselves and think about our hero systems and how society works, it almost seems like if there's anything that we can give this label to, is probably something like that. And I think that's fine to depict.
I wonder if that's why there aren't as like mass shooter movies almost as much, or why those don't have the same place in our culture, is because we feel like it's such an easy slam dunk case to make. Whereas with something like war, maybe we have more of a need to quell our doubts about it.
Probably a little bit. There was a movie that came out that kind of did that. It was about the Boston Marathon bombing. And they do make some comments about, like, there is some implication with the Tsarnaev brothers who perpetrated the bombings. There is an implication that, like, the older brother was, like, the more radicalized one, and the younger brother was just kind of, like, going along with, like, his, like, older brother. Like, he was heavily influenced by his older brother. But it is kind of framed in, like, these people are bad, and, like, the government needs to come in and, like, stop these people from doing more harm, basically. But you usually don't see, I think, movies usually based around events like that. Or they're usually met with like extreme, maybe not extreme, but like they're usually met with, skepticism is the right word, I guess, like a little bit of moral outrage of like, how can you make a movie about this event? It was like so wholly bad. But like, we'll make movies about the Holocaust and like wars and a bunch of shit. Yeah, right.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, because I think, if you make mass shooter movies, you're gonna be accused of like exploiting something horrific. But then we can go make a movie about a war where 40 million people died, and I don't know.
Yeah, it's I think there's probably like I always go back and forth between, and it's probably a little bit of both. There probably is some like underlying social reasons why that's happening, but I think it probably also is that people are engaging on like a surface level value, and that like they are just familiar with certain types of media that don't appear as
that's
immediately.
The right answer.
God bless the United States and this honorable tribunal.
A good way to illustrate this is by looking at the aftermath of the Second World War. In her report on the trial of Adolf Eichmann, Hannah Arendt also brought attention to the issue of punishment, which the film Judgment at Nuremberg also brings up.
Well, let's face it. Hitler is gone, Goebbels is gone, Goering is gone, committed suicide before they could hang him. Now we're down to the business of judging the doctors, businessmen, and judges. Some people think they shouldn't be judged at all.
The film extensively explores how the Nazi regime came into power and how it led to the terrible crimes against humanity, but it also zooms in on the experiences of ordinary citizens.
Good people. Believe that. What was it like for you living under Hitler?
And there is a genuine attempt to understand what happened from their perspective. We can immediately see how it raises important questions. What heroic victory was promised them? How did it all turn so violent? How did all the good people go along with it? And perhaps most importantly, who is really responsible? The reason questions like these can be rather uncomfortable is because they invoke another question. If it happened to them, could it happen to us? And more specifically, could this happen to me? Am I too susceptible to this great evil?
Für alle, denen noch nicht klar ist, warum sie hier sind hierher nach Dänemark gebracht worden, hier nach dem Krieg etwas aufzuräumen.
The film Land of Mine also presents an insightful reflection on these issues. Set in Denmark just after the Second World War, the story follows German prisoners of war who were forced to clear beaches from landmines. A highly dangerous job that, not unsurprisingly, claimed many of their lives and was later deemed one of Denmark's worst war crimes. As the Danish officer begins to question what justice is really achieved by putting these young and largely inexperienced boys through this kind of punishment, we are shown how easy it is to overextend our holy wars against evil. How easy it is to misdirect anger and desire for justice onto those who do not deserve it. And how easy it is to choose personal gratification over asking the all-important question. Who is really responsible for the violence and destruction of hero systems?
That sounds like a really interesting movie. I've not seen it, but that sounds like an interesting premise that they were just describing.
I have watched the movie. It's a really good movie. I think it does. There is a little simplification that happens with it because the prisoners of war that the guy is given are mostly like very late war, like almost like 15 to like 18-year-old boys that were like conscripted to like fight while like Nazi Germany was falling apart. Mm-hmm. So I think there is kind of like an immediate bias to want the character to like warm up to the kids because like clearly these are people that did not have like the capacity to like understand what they were doing or like make decisions like that. I think It might have been more. It's based off of real events. But I think it might have been a little more impactful if some of the prisoners of war were older. I think that would have been a lot more interesting. Because there is kind of like an immediate assumption to like, well, they're kids. They didn't really have a choice on what they were doing. They were very obviously controlled by their society or indoctrinated or something.
But if they had had some like higher ranking German officers in there or something?
Not even necessarily higher ranking. I mean, sure that, but like just like older in general, like maybe like mid-20s or maybe 30s or something too. Like, or even 40, like older, right? Like you have people who have the capacity to grapple with like what happened. And it's not purely seen as like a thing that was perpetrated on them, right? Because then the immediate moral response is to be like, well, it wasn't the kids' fault. It was the entity of Germany's fault that made them fight this way, or like that made them do this. And now they're seeing unforeseen punishments for it. But I think it is more interesting when you start talking about like, if we're talking about the Nuremberg trials or post-World War II, right? Like there were lots of people who had the ability to either go along with something or not go along with it and could think about it. And do we punish these people? Like, how long do we enact those punishments on them? Do we like think it's good if we punish them at all? Like, should they suffer any repercussions, or like, do we engage with them as a way that like they were victims of like a system that they were just happened to be in at that time? I think like I think that becomes a lot more interesting. But the movie itself is really good. I think most people should watch it. But
What was the title of it?
it's called A Land of Mine. That's the English title of it. Yeah.
Was impossible. Only proof of that would be their dead bodies lying in the bottom of the trenches. A scum, whole rotten regiment.
In Stanley Kubrick's Paths of Glory, a battalion of soldiers fails to execute an impossible order that would have gotten them all killed, after which the officers arbitrarily pick 3 of them to put on trial for cowardice. Our main hero does his best to defend them, but it becomes clear that the whole show is rigged from the start, and the men end up being executed as we watch, knowing full well their deaths serve no meaningful purpose besides pointless bureaucracy and the grandiosity of uncaring leaders.
The thing is always rather grim. But this one had a kind of splendor to it, do you think?
The important lesson here is that hero systems do not have equal power structures. More often than not, there is a hierarchy that is purposefully kept in place by those at the top who personally benefit from it. On the surface, this may be because of greed, grandiosity, or a hunger for power. But beneath all that, it is probably because of the simple reason, as Becker points out, that it fulfills their own immortality fantasy.
Of course, it would be absolutely vital that our top government and military men be included.
Kubrick also effectively demonstrates this in his film Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. Here we not only see how the incompetency of the established forces of the Cold War lead to an all-destructive nuclear apocalypse, but also how, being promised a safe shelter and plentiful women, their only concern is themselves.
Actually, they would breed prodigiously, eh? There would be much time and little to do.
In a way, it shows how leaders and other prominent figures of hero systems are often the ones who are most deluded by them.
I mean, you're young. You're just out of the academy. You got your war. This is 15 years. This is my first war.
Can we pause
As
for a
such,
second?
they are also likely to be the most disconnected.
I think it makes a lot of sense that the people who feel the most responsible for the decisions involved are going to be the people who have the most need to rationalize it to themselves and are therefore likely to they have the most reason to do the post hoc justification for the system that they're upholding.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the more reason you have, like, the more reasons you're going to come up with to defend yourself. It usually implies like some type of at least introspection on their part that they know that like they are responsible for like a certain thing, right? Like it, and
Right.
I think it is, yeah.
They don't have just following orders to fall back on, right? So they have to come up with more idealistic reasons for what they're doing.
Yeah, well, I was doing it because of this, or I had this excuse or whatever. It's not just like, well, I was, to go back to the previous part, it's like, I'm not just a kid who was like born during this time period and I didn't really have any idea what I was doing. It's, I'm an adult who should have responsibility, and now I have to rationalize why I did those things.
Right.
And people either go down, I think there's like 3 different types of roads you can go down, where you either just convince yourself to not introspect about that. There's one where you double down on like the rationalizations that you're giving, or there's ones where you do serious introspection on what you did and then form a different opinion on it after the fact. But
right. Although I've got to suspect there's probably a selection effect where certain personality types are the ones that are likely to rise to the top in authoritarian systems, and I bet it's not the people who are most likely to second guess themselves who are.
Of course not. Yeah, it doesn't reward that at all. Yeah.
Right.
I think there was an interesting bit there that I didn't think about before, was who benefits in certain hero systems in terms of like if there's a hierarchy established. And yeah, that is interesting to think about. I think I need to deliberate on it more by myself.
I wonder if you could think of it as a transaction, right? Where like both the superiors and the subordinates get something out of it, and what the subordinates get is this like narrative validation of their sacrifice, and what the superiors get is the material benefit of the sacrifice.
Mm-hmm. Or when we're talking about that definitely, that seems intuitive to me. There's also another intuitive thing where it's like, well, if something goes right, the superiors get the benefit of claiming a lot of the credit for it.
Yeah.
And then the people below hand, well, they don't get the same glorification. They do get to say they were part of something, but they are obviously more exposed to like certain dangers and stuff like that. Whereas opposed to the other way around, if the leaders fail, then the subordinates have a potential scapegoat to basically like be like, well, I wasn't in charge. I didn't make that decision. That wasn't they absolve themselves morally of some of the responsibility if something does go wrong. Whereas leaders don't typically get to do that. They may try to, but within that system, it seems like they typically don't get to.
So one of them is taking on the kind of like material risk, and the other one is taking on the ideological risk.
Yeah, like if I'm like a foot soldier in the Wehrmacht during World War II, it's like, sure, there's like a lot of material, or there's a lot of material I could die. But I can be like, well, I was just like following orders. There's a certain thing there. And obviously there are critiques of that. Right. But within that moral system, it seems to be a function of it too.
Right.
Connected from any real sense of humanity, and therefore most willing to sacrifice it for their own heroic victory over death.
Some of the men pass out. Hell, they'll just have to pass out.
But because hero systems have fundamentally unequal power relations, this also implies that those on top do not have to make the same sacrifices as those on the bottom. In fact, it is precisely because others make the costly sacrifices that those in privileged positions can enjoy their heroic victory.
Yeah, pre-watched.
And it is for this reason that those who benefit from hero systems the most also benefit from deliberately obscuring this inequality.
Well, it might be deliberately obscuring it, or it might be justifying it.
Do you understand?
Sir, yes, sir!
At face value, boot camps are rites of passage that build character, form brotherhoods, and train new recruits for the hardship and challenges of war. They can be seen as either a lesser evil that is necessary to prepare recruits for the greater evil of actual war, or even as a challenge to aspire to.
I was hooked.
Hit.
But looking at it more critically, boot camps provide measurements for heroism that recruits can meet, exceed, or fall short of. It turns their entry into the hero system into a competition, and tells them only the worthy deserve to succeed.
You're gamifying it.
It's a quitter. You say goodbye, I say good riddance.
In doing so, the perceived obstacle becomes not the unequal structure of that competition, nor the fact that it marginalizes entire groups of people through racism, homophobia, and general bigotry.
You must have Cherokee or Shawnee blood in you.
No, sir.
Are you contradicting me? You wagon-burning son of a bitch! No, Sergeant!
The perceived obstacle becomes the weak and unworthy that are holding them back, that need to be separated from the strong and deserving, which explains why we so often see recruits becoming hostile to those of their own, those who are perceived to be in their way of heroic victory. It also explains why for many people the boot camp sequence in Full Metal Jacket did not achieve its intended effect, because while it does show how this ritual can end in a tragedy, it shows the tragedy as driven by the weaker link of the group, which raises the question, does this really question the nature of the boot camp and its place within an unequal hero system, or does it merely suggest that this particular individual was not cut out for it, which in turn would only affirm its primary function and even its necessity, rather than critique it?
I was a good soldier. I had purpose. I loved it.
Another way a hero system's inequality is obscured is by downplaying the traumatic experiences of soldiers. Within highly militaristic hero systems, trauma is a token of the shadow, a weakness that suggests that the hero system is not successful in achieving its heroic victory, and could therefore bring the whole thing into question. Hence, it is rather avoided.
You are my hammer out there. Don't let these young guys see you fold like this. Bad for morale. Bad for big army.
The film Thank You for Your Service sheds some light on how the suppression of trauma can have devastating consequences for veterans, in particular when this suppression extends to institutions and services that are supposed to take care of them.
It could be 6 to 9 months.
You think these guys can wait that long?
But what is perhaps the most effective shield to deflect criticisms on the nature of hero systems, and the final and most resilient barrier towards making a true anti-war film, is heroism itself.
We like things nice and simple. Good and evil. Heroes and villains.
So far we have discussed how anti-war films can critique hero systems through the purposeful use of violence, examinations of other hero systems, and by exposing how the promise of heroic victory is abused by people in power to let others make the great sacrifices, only to cast them aside afterwards. But to truly deconstruct a hero system is to face what Monet argued is the greatest taboo of militarism. That is, the possibility that military deaths are in fact for nothing, that there is no such thing as a hero. And yet, it is a taboo we're going to have to break, because it is also one that reveals a lot about the way in which heroes, and particularly stories of heroes, are used to keep hero systems in place and to undermine true anti-war films.
Seeing him in that photo, I don't know why it makes me feel better, but it does.
In the film Flags of Our Fathers, a mother is led to believe that her fallen son was in the now famous photograph of the planting of the American flag on Iwo Jima, even though it is revealed to us that he wasn't. And we are shown how those in control of such stories know how cruel it would be to take that away from a grieving mother, to tell her that her son's death didn't have the significance she thought it had, and therefore how it is much easier to just go along with the story and not question the more complicated and much more political reality behind it.
To be honest, ma'am, it happened so quick and, yeah, I think that's where he was. That's Hank.
And the thing is, they are right. It is cruel, inhumane even, to rob grieving families of their last bit of consolation. But the problem is that the sacrifices made by these soldiers are also easily weaponized in a way that prevents us from questioning why those sacrifices had to be made in the first place. This can be done deliberately, but it is also something that often happens inadvertently out of compassion and decency towards the human lives that were lost. Because it is true that to attack a hero system is to attack the significance it gives to death, and therefore to attack a hero system is to attack the significance of the deaths of real people, which in turn can easily be experienced as inconsiderate or disrespectful. I think
there's a it's one of those things where it kind of comes back to like the discussion we had earlier about like conflict seems so imbued and like our analysis or like our view of everything that like how do you even, it's like, well, hero worship is a thing, sure, and I understand that it has immense problems with it, but it almost seems like impossible to get rid of.
Mm-hmm.
Or like it like can a society like even function without a hero system, what we would call a hero system, right? Because it seems like even like it seems like even from what I know, even like societies of like chimps or like apes like operate on like a similar thing too, where like they have like certain like individuals within that tribe or group like reach some plateau, and then like other people within that group will strive to be like that person. It seems like it's almost like it seems impossible to like remove ourselves from that context.
Oh, yeah. I mean, a minute ago, I was thinking about how to interpret this in light of rationalizing the sacrifices of the people dying, but I think it does make sense what you're saying in like an evo psych kind of way, which I don't think we can prove that this is why it happens, but what makes sense is that if primitive human societies were kind of just hierarchical in nature, and there's some part of our brain that's adapted to that and comfortable with it, then we're going to replicate that in lots of different ways, even when we're out of that context. What I was thinking a minute ago was the idea that people are so discomforted by death and so uneasy with it. I think this is why people have got to either downplay it or valorize it, because if they don't do one of those things, they will be perceived as like as if death has power over us rather than we have power over death, right? So just the act of assigning to it a level of importance is like an act of moral authority, if that makes any sense.
A little bit, yeah. No, I get what you're saying. It's like it kind of goes back to the beginning of the video, where now I feel like there probably is some truth in like the analysis of like it does kind of stem from like a fear of death almost. Where like there is a rationalization that is happening to, like you said, like have power over that thing that's like inevitable, that like we don't understand, or that's like unknown, right? We're trying to ascribe some type of value onto it that we understand.
Yeah, because like it's going to create this perception that like if we get to decide how important death is or isn't, and we get to decide how we're going to use it to meet our ideological ends, it is almost as if we have subordinated death in some weird symbolic sense, right?
Yeah. And we can't operate, we can't confront it materially, so we confront it metaphorically or like within like society, right? In a way that doesn't actually... It's not materially, like we're not becoming immortal, but like physically, but we're trying to find some way around it, which kind of ties it back into like the main theme that was stated at the beginning. But it seems like this is like a much broader question than like the anti-war stuff. Is like, can you exist in a world where like everyone accepts like basically like a nihilistic worldview? And it's probably no.
No, because we're not emotionally built for that.
Yeah.
And as far as how it applies to war specifically, it's like I think the act of killing a person is a demonstration of power over death in a way.
Yeah. And like I'm gonna have to think about that sentence more.
It's a little bit poetic rather than literal.
A little bit, yeah. I would have to do some unpacking there. That's definitely a...
But it sounds right, doesn't it?
It's intuitively it feels right. Like, oh yeah, that does make sense. But when I'm thinking about it, I'm like, how am I gonna? I probably could create some type of explanation for that. Yeah.
If we are the ones who decide how and when death arrives, then it is like as if we have conquered death. Even if not our own death, we've at least conquered someone else's.
Other people's, yeah. There's like a power. There's a power dynamic there that is.
Yeah, and perhaps that alleviates slightly our own fear of death to believe that we have power over it in a more generalized, abstract sense.
I think that makes
it's not a thing that like it's not like a logical proof or whatever, but I feel like in a poetic, emotional sense, this kind of works.
It does. I think if I just like feel that statement, I know that sounds like whatever, but if I just feel my way through it, it intuitively feels correct. Like, oh, yeah, of course we want control of that. But when I started thinking about it, I'm like, I don't know. But maybe kind of part of me was like, well, we are emotionally driven creatures. So like, does it even have to make sense if it just makes us feel that way? Like,
right. Yeah, because I mean, I think we have like a monkey brain and then a logic brain on top of it, right? And the logic brain wants to reject that, but the monkey brain is very comfortable with it. I think is kind of what's happening.
It's us trying to rationalize having control over our monkey brain. That's us trying to have.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think it is because of this reason that so many films ultimately fail to truly deliver on their anti-war statement, and end up with what is at best a hate the war but love the warrior kind of story. A story that acknowledges the destructiveness of war, and even the problematic nature of the hero systems that led to them, but also sidesteps any real commentary on it, which again is perfectly understandable and certainly an issue that can be born out of the best of intentions.
The real heroes are dead on that island.
Stories like these often focus on the individual soldiers, their bravery and sacrifices, their loyalty and brotherhood.
But for my dad and these men, the risks they took, the wounds they suffered, they did that for their buddies.
They won't understand.
Hey, I got you.
It's about the men next to you. That's it.
But by highlighting these personal virtues and meaningful qualities, they can't help but at least partially redeem what they also want to critique. This also becomes clear when we look at how these stories are experienced by us. For the immediate emotional impact of heroic war stories is undeniable. They move us, they make us feel grateful, they leave us in tears over the great sacrifices that were made, especially when it comes to true stories, and most of them are. But we have to ask, what purpose do they really serve? What does it mean for us to sit in the comfort of our homes and consume stories of tragic war heroes? This is where we have to move away from the successes and shortcomings of war films, and towards the role that we play as their audience. Because if filmmakers are complicit in failing at anti-war, then so are we. In the film 1917, we follow Lance Corporal Schofield, who is tasked with delivering a vital message that will prevent 1,600 men from walking into a deadly trap. And there's this moment towards the end where, after having gone through hell, Schofield finally reaches the battalion and collapses down between them. And I thought, this could have been a really powerful ending. To have Schofield die between these joyful young men who are completely oblivious to what they're about to walk into. Or better yet, he delivers the message but it is discarded by the overzealous commander, as also almost seems to happen, and Schofield is left powerless as the men storm off towards their fateful end. I can only imagine what a statement that could have been on the needless waste of human life in war. Of course, this is not what happens. Instead, Schofield gets the great hero shot and succeeds at his mission, thereby saving not all but still many, many lives. Now, it was still a rather bittersweet ending, but overall I felt relieved at the end, and I found myself rewatching that one heroic scene because it was just so powerful. But then I started wondering what this really implies, and this brought me to another film.
Paint the tombs of the prophets. They look up and they imagine that if they lived back in Christ's time, they wouldn't have done what the others did.
There's an interesting scene in A Hidden Life in which the main character meets a painter who questions the purpose of his religious imagery. While the film is about an Austrian man resisting the Nazi regime, an act for which he is eventually prosecuted and killed. This particular sequence touches on a more fundamental issue about how we relate ourselves to hero systems, and especially heroic stories within those hero systems.
What we do is just create sympathy. We create admirers. We don't create followers.
As we've seen in the opening discussion, the potential for anti-war partly depends on the eye of the beholder, and it is here that Becker makes what is probably the most confronting observation, as he argues that this beholder is by default a fundamentally selfish one. According to him, the price we pay for being naturally narcissistic animals is that very few of us, if pressured, would be unwilling to sacrifice someone else in our place. This is why we worship heroes so much, as they are the exception to this rule. They make the sacrifices so few are willing to make. But what we are reluctant to admit, Becker continues, is that the admiration of the hero is a vicarious catharsis of our own fears, fears that are deeply hidden. And this is what plunges us into uncritical hero worship. What the hero does seems so superlative to us. In other words, the danger of worshipping heroes is that we end up admiring them not as a means to an end, that is, as an inspiration for meaningful transformation, but instead as an end in itself. Like the phenomenon of scapegoating, we can project our desire for heroic victory onto others, and through their heroism, enjoy it as if it were our own. I say this was a confronting observation because it certainly was so for me. I love war films, and I love to think I'm a better person for watching them, for soaking in the suffering of others and believing it guides me towards better values. But there is a confession to be made here. I have never helped out families of fallen soldiers. I don't donate to organizations supporting veterans who are struggling at home. I'm not marching down the streets in defiance of war. I'm not actively protesting military recruitment programs that are preying on the young who are still impressionable and on the marginalized who are led to believe they have no other recourse for a meaningful life. I'm watching these heroic war stories, in part because I am genuinely in awe of seeing the power and perseverance of the human spirit, but also because it feeds into my own narcissism. I love seeing these acts of heroism and, as I'm sure many others do, I imagine that could be me. I like to believe that, if the situation demands it, I too would be capable of making the great sacrifice. I too would emerge as a hero. Though the reality is, I probably won't. And yet, I indulge myself in the fantasy, and even find a strange sense of moral accomplishment in doing so. As in, I already feel more heroic just because I can imagine myself being so. The experience is not unlike watching superhero films, but of course the difference is that these are stories about real people, and they really got killed. And so it is important to ask ourselves if we are truly honoring and giving significance to those lives, or if we too are turning them into sacrificial lambs that only serve our own vanity and provide us with personal comfort.
Christ's life is a demand. You don't want to be reminded of it. I paint their comfortable Christ with a halo over his head. We don't have to see what happens to the truth.
If we are to fully understand the potential for and meaning of anti-war films, we have to acknowledge the possibility that there is a deep-down secret part of us that does not want them. Because by truly attacking the hero systems that drive us to war, we are also attacking a part of ourselves. The part that longs for our own heroic victory over death,
Can we
for our
pause for a
own
second?
achievement of greater significance.
I feel like there actually is a hero narrative to the anti-war message, right? Because if you see war itself as a great evil, then you can sort of think of yourself as slightly heroic just by opposing it, or you could even engage with some of the like same bravery, virtue signaling that goes on in these movies, right? You could say like, well, I have the courage to confront a difficult subject rather than cower from it, and does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. I think I forget if he said the exact term that I want to use just right now. But I think a good term to use would kind of be like or something along the lines of scapegoating is usually used as a negative. Here are these negative things. We're going to scapegoat it onto like a group of people.
Yeah.
I think there is positive scapegoating that he kind of illustrates within the video of like, here are positive traits and I'm going to like scapegoat them or like outsource them to other people. And that allows me to feel comfortable, like, oh, I'm watching this war movie and I can feel good about the fact that I'm engaging with this material. But in reality, you're not really doing anything different. All you're doing is, I guess, engaging with the material, I guess. But that doesn't really make you good. But you're almost like outsourcing or like scapegoating your own, like the good parts of the morality that you think you have onto other people. and so you're like not taking responsibility over it.
So
I think that's a
Are you kind of saying it's almost like a form of cultural reassurance where if just merely seeing how prevalent the hero narrative is might make me feel like I'm living among virtuous people? Is it something like that?
A little bit. It's kind of like even just like considering or removedly like interacting with these concepts in and of itself is almost a good thing. But that's if that's the extent of your interaction, then I think it's almost outsourcing or scapegoating to a degree because you're not engaging with it any further. It's not like it's like he says in the video, like he's like, I haven't like, donated to charities or like participated in debates about these things or like interacted with these people beyond media. Right. But yeah, I somehow still feel like I have an emotion that makes me feel like morally fulfilled. Right. But in reality, materially, I haven't changed my behavior or like done anything. Right.
If I talk about like satisficers versus maximizers, does that mean anything to you? Do you know what I'm talking about?
No, I don't know those terms.
Okay, so those are terms that will come up in economics and also in psychology. And basically the idea is that and also in artificial intelligence. Okay.
Oh, okay.
So like let's say you have some set of values. If you act as a maximizer, then you are just trying to do the best you can with respect to those values. But if you act as a satisficer, you are attempting to just do good enough with respect to those values. And I sort of think usually it is the case, it seems to me, that people act much more as satisficers rather than maximizers. Like they just generally want to do good enough rather than the best they can. And if people feel some responsibility to engage with this kind of serious material, then perhaps the mere act of consuming anti-war media might make you feel like you are doing good enough, and therefore you need to do no more.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a comfortability with something. It's like, oh well, I did that thing, so I've exemplified my moral virtue by my mere interaction with the topic, right? Like,
right, and if you feel that satisfaction, you kind of remove from yourself the same impetus that was getting you to engage with those topics in the first place, and it's like, assuming that if there is some good you could have done by marching with veterans or whatever it is, then perhaps you might be squashing your own motivation to do it by just like being a voyeur instead.
Yeah, you're not. Yeah, it says in the video like the interacting with the media in that way is in and of itself the means to that end, right? Like you're not pursuing it outside of that engagement. So that is becoming the thing that you're engaging with, but you're not using it as like a springboard into like other things, right?
Yeah, it's substituting for moral virtue rather than facilitating it.
Yeah, it's kind of like, it's kind of like a substitution for anything else, right? Like, well, I need to make friends and have social interaction. Well, what if I substitute it with ChatGPT and I talk to him all night? It's like, yeah, like I guess you're like, technically engaging with it that way, but that's not that wasn't the reason that you originally engaged with it. It should be a springboard into other things that you do that are more meaningful. And that might cause a lot of problems, especially on like social from like when you start talking about like masses of people. It might cause a problem where people feel good when they go to watch the sad war movie that comes out every year, but how many people are actually reaching out after that point to support like veterans causes or mental health awareness or anything like that, right? Because then it sort of becomes this this like social anesthetic's not the word I'm looking for.
I think that's a good one, even if it isn't the one you were looking for.
Yeah, it kind of becomes this thing that you take to be like, okay, like, oh, we all participated in the socially approved activity or the socially expected activity of publicly saying that we care about this thing. I mean, this applies to like so much stuff, right? Like, like if you're on Twitter complaining about something and that's like the extent of your activism, it's like, well, I feel so great that I've complained about this publicly and now I won't do any more things because that is what satisfies me enough
Right.
like,
so
yeah.
so it's like if you want to solve some big societal problem, raising awareness is an important first step to do it. But if everybody does nothing but raise awareness, they aren't really like doing the rest of the problem. They're just doing the easy part that makes you feel satisfied as if you've contributed to the problem. And in some small way, maybe you have contributed. But if you just stop, like we can't all just stop there, right?
Yeah, or else nothing's gonna happen. Nothing's gonna get done. I think, at least for me personally, and this is like irrespective of the topic, but like in a similar way, I have a problem where I will, when it comes to personal projects, I will like the initial phase of like ideation and exploration and brainstorming. When I do that, after that, I feel incredibly good and almost satisfied to the point where I'm like, I have finished this project in my head mentally.
Yeah.
Now all the hard part is actually performing and like manifesting all that.
There's
But
a danger
I've
in
satisfied-
feeling. There's a danger in feeling too satisfied at the fact that you have just begun it.
Yeah. And now you have all the stuff that you need to do that doesn't feel that way, because then that requires actual hard work and struggle and determination and, you know, discipline and stuff like that. And those things aren't considered like fun or stuff, right? And this is a critique about war movies too, where there's a lot of stuff that gets left out of like, it's not just cool action movie scenes. Like there's like years or days or months of stuff that is just really boring to sit through. Like you'll talk to any person who's been in the military and they're like, most of the time it's just boring. Like you're just doing nothing or you're just waiting around for
But if a movie were like that, you wouldn't watch it.
Exactly, yeah. So it has all the interesting stuff condensed down into like this one point, and then you get your like dopamine hit off of that, and then you go on with your life as if you did something.
Yeah, I think the thing about personal projects that you said was really interesting, because it's like there's this sort of this high that you get from starting a project, but then there's like this emotional labor that you have to do to finish it, and it's like it's so difficult for people to drag themselves through it. But here we are talking about how difficult it is to do emotional labor in the same video where we're talking about people like literally sacrificing their lives for their ideals, and it's like this insane juxtaposition that it's like easier to get people to die for a cause than it is to get them to just like do hard work for a personal project.
Yeah, I mean there is like this could be like a human biology thing or like evo psych thing. Like people will talk about like, oh well, isn't it crazy now that like people are like depressed and they don't have any meaning and they just lay around all day. But back in the day, like we were hunters and gatherers and like we would trek across continents to find food. And like in a way, it's like, well, that's like a human meaning problem, right? Like, it's really easy to find meaning if your meaning in your life is like, I have to go get food today. Like we talked about earlier, like my meaning is to go get food today so we don't die. And like, sure, it might be like strenuously difficult, but like your goal and objective is like clear and focused, and that's all you have to worry about. And so like when people will talk about like simple lives are better, or like even like quote unquote like more traditional lives are better where things are clearly defined, it's like, well, for humans, I think we work really well when things are clearly defined, and that fits into like we don't like having like unknown problems or like dealing with things that we can't describe meaning onto, or that like are outside of our realm of knowledge. So things that we do know are much more comforting and easy to deal with. And it's like, I understand that like, well, you know, in like antiquity or the primitive era, like it's like my goal is to get food and this is really easy and I understand this goal, right? But if we're in a current society, it's like, well, I have to work on a project and like hopefully this project advances my career, that I think I want to do this thing, and then I have to structure my day around it. Becomes very convoluted very quickly. So like,
so like the
in a way, like engaging in war is a very direct, makes sense way for people to like find meaning, right?
Yeah, absolutely, and I think it's a little bit vague what we mean when we say meaning, but the way that I'm gonna interpret that is to engage with stuff that's emotionally compelling, and I think if you're a hunter gatherer fighting for your survival every day, there's very little danger that you will not be emotionally engaged in the work that you're doing. But I think that's just not true with a lot of modern people and the work that we have to do. It's easy to ask yourself, why does this matter, in a way that a hunter-gatherer would never do. And so then perhaps we're like vicariously getting some of that feeling of importance and emotional engagement through this type of media that's like valorizing certain aspects of modern life in order to just like jolt us into caring about it.
Yeah, like it's a very clear, direct conflict again that it's easy to map onto, and it's like, yeah, it is crazy that like we're talking about like doing personal art projects is so hard, and we're talking about media where like that's representing like people actually going to go like are going to die during that, and I think it shows like how much power, not necessarily how good, but how much power these narratives have. That like if you lay out something that's clear enough and that's like direct enough, people can put up with a lot and endure a lot and potentially like die for it, right? Like
yeah,
but something so simple as like finishing a project can be like insanely mentally difficult for someone.
Yeah.
So I think like it seems like humans really just grasp onto those immediate direct conflicts that have like a very clear hero system like the video talks about, but also just like a clear delineation of like meaning within that conflict too.
I wonder if we could take that kind of the way that war movies are emotionally compelling. I wonder if there's a way to like reframe this and apply it to personal projects, right? Because it's like when we look at these hero narratives in war, it's like if people are going to die for their country or die for a cause, and we feel like that gives meaning to their sacrifice. I wonder if you could say a similar thing about the sacrifice of emotional labor you have to do to...
There is a I'm gonna scooch over here for a second. There's a book that's really good for creatives. It's called The War of Art, and it does set it up in the dynamic where like the thing that is causing you all your creative breaks is like you have like on one end you have like determination and will to do it, and on the other end I think it classifies it as like, I think the author Stephen Pressfield just calls it resistance, and it's like this concept of just like anything that comes in your way is just resistance, and your like creative work is like an eternal struggle against this thing. And it's like he frames it in kind of like a spiritual war that you have to engage with every time you do something creative. And I think that's like getting a little bit at that, where it's like framing it in like this almost like religious or like cosmic sense of like, you have the forces of good and evil, and in order to combat evil you need discipline and all this stuff. And it's almost like you're removing the actual individual things of what you're doing in your project. Like the book's not telling you, okay, well, if you're writing a paper, you start with paragraph 1 and then you break that down to thesis sentence 2. It's like, no, when you're doing this, think about it as like if you're in a war, and it doesn't even matter what you're writing, but as long as you're going against resistance, you're making progress against it. And it's like a justified thing that you can get meaning out of. But
it's so funny to just call it resistance, because it's just like, it's like saying go fight the enemy. But it's like, yeah, what is the enemy? I don't know. It doesn't matter. Like as long as it motivates you to go fight it.
There's 2 movies with Tom Cruise that remind me of this. The last one was obviously Top Gun. If you haven't seen Top Gun Maverick, they never identify who the enemy is in the movie. It's just like a country that they don't name, and they only call, I think they literally just call the bad guys like the enemy, because it's not important. I mean, it's not important to the movie really. And there's certain context clues that you could pick up on. It's kind of like, it's a mixture, if you know your geopolitics well, it's kind of a mixture between like Iran and North Korea and like Russia. But like within the context of the movie, they don't even name them. It's just like, it's about the hero worship in the movie and the hero structure and the characters wanting to be like Tom Cruise. And then they go fight the enemy. And then like, that's the conclusion of the movie. And then in I think it's the latest Mission Impossible movie, there are bad guys within that movie that are clearly defined, but there's a scene where Tom Cruise is being chased by these guys in a city and he's trying to get away. And Benji comes over the little microphone in his ear and he goes, "Who's even chasing you?" And then Tom Cruise says, or the Tom Cruise character says a line. He's like, "I don't know, but it doesn't even matter." And it's like, it's kind of that like way of thinking of like, it doesn't even matter who the enemy is. It's just it's a resistance thing. It's some type of opposition force that I have to contend with. And it doesn't even matter what the content of that is. It's just as long as they're in direct opposition to me or like in opposition to me. But
I wonder if it would help to like personify it though, right? Like if you're just struggling to find motivation for an art project, it's like imagine that Kim Jong-un, Vladimir Putin, and Ayatollah Khomeini are trying. Or they really don't want you to do your art. They're trying to stop you so hard. But you've got to beat them. Like you can't let them win.
Yeah. I mean, like these are really fun ways to like interact with things that would otherwise be like mundane or like hard to put meaning onto. And that does kind of circle back to the like, I don't think you can exist in like a like society full of nihilists, right? Like you need to find some type of meaning, even if it's like a like social construct that you're imposing onto it. Like you need some type of like course through which to apply yourself through. But like, yeah, I like even if it's like simplifying these things or whatever, like it seems like humans need it on some level. I don't know if they can exist without it. Like,
this is what religions do, right? They a lot of times have some antagonist figure to struggle against, though, right?
Yeah.
And it's like whether it's I wonder if like Satan is just more emotionally compelling than resistance.
Mm-hmm.
But
yeah,
it's like
personifying it.
Psychologically, it's just like the same thing, but with a
with a face to it or something. Yeah. There's a I know there's like some like I know the timeline of like how Satan or the devil was inserted into especially Christianity is a little, I don't know that much about it, but I know it was like a later creation for that, right?
It's not really in the Old Testament the same way it's in the New Testament.
Yeah. The forces there seem more abstract, whereas like the more time has gone on, it seems like the more that concept has gotten a little more defined now. Because then it makes it, as a conflict thing, it makes it more interesting, right? Like there's a guy, there's like an entity out there that has a name that like we draw pictures of. It's like, this is the bad guy and he's the thing causing all the bad things. And now you've outsourced all your evil morality onto him. And I don't have to think about me being evil because there's this bad guy that's causing all the problems. Did you ever see the first Wonder Woman movie?
Yeah.
The recent one? Okay.
I did. I know exactly where you're going with this. With like, she thinks Ares is like the personification of war, and if she just beats him, all the evils of war will disappear. And then she's like shocked when it doesn't work.
She's shocked when it. Well, they do like a double fake out because like that is like her goal, and like I forget that Chris Pine's character. He like. There's sort of a climax when they get to the airfield at the end and he's talking to her and he's like, look, war isn't that simple. Like you can't just define it as good and evil. These are complex things you have to engage with that way. But then the movie does a double reveal where it's like, actually it was Ares' fault all along. And then Wonder Woman beats him and World War I ends. And you're like, oh, like, it's like, what are we doing? It's just like, yeah, I think the movie would have been so much better if they just went with the first ending, because that would have felt like a genuine like message to have. But instead, it does the thing that I guess humans want, where they're like, there is this one bad guy causing all the problems or something.
So maybe we need to have a god of unfinished projects, and you can just be like, I hate that guy so fucking much while you're working on art.
to make it easier. Maybe like. Yeah, like I'm sure that like people have already written like advice books or something around this. Like I know some successful artist friends of mine do have systems like that because they need that extra type of like engagement with it. Not all of them. I won't say like everyone obviously doesn't do it. Some people just view it as like, this is work I have to do. And maybe they just have like a very easy way to like interact with discipline and those types of things. But I do have like some friends, and there are some artists that talk about like, yeah, I have to reframe this in my mind to like keep me going or like get through like tough periods of like personal work or projects or just like life. And yeah, like religions obviously serve as a purpose for this too, or like broader like, you know, social things, right? Like,
oh god, Hitler was an artist who was partially motivated by his antagonism towards the people in art school.
He's like the fallen angel. He's the Satan of the unfinished art project.
Yeah, exactly.
He got kicked. He was not allowed entrance into the kingdom of heaven.
Yeah.
And he sought to create his own domain where he held all the power.
And Hitler kind of is almost like a Satan figure in modern secular morality too.
Yeah, he is. I think it works.
Yeah.
I feel like I have a self-help creative book in the works now. I think I'm gonna start writing on it once the stream ends. How to turn Hitler into how to make all of your problems into Hitler. True. It's probably good. We don't have that long on this. We should probably finish it and then we could like wrap it up after, yeah.
Sure, yeah.
And so it is understandable that instead of truly striving for anti-war, for the absolute deconstruction of hero systems, it is extremely tempting to instead cling to our reassuring tale of the hero, to our comfortable Christ.
Someday I might have the courage to venture. Not yet. Someday I'll paint the true Christ.
In the conclusion to his book, Becker poses what is probably the most burning question after all this, that being, what is possible? We have discussed our instinctive urge to transcend death through symbolic significance, how hero systems have emerged to achieve this, and how they have destructive consequences by projecting our fears and weaknesses onto others. For Becker, this is not a condition to be overcome, but a necessity to be able to stand life. The fact is that men cannot and do not stand on their own powers, he writes. Moral dependence is a natural motive of the human condition and has to be absolved from something beyond oneself. What this implies is that we need heroes, villains, meaningful action. We need stories. We need that which grants us significance. In Becker's words, this makes us an impossible animal, one who, individually, needs for healthy action the very conduct that, on a general level, is destructive to him. This also is the great struggle of the anti-war film. There is a part of us that simply cannot face the reality of its implications. We cannot truly face the meaningless waste of human life. We cannot truly accept the possibility that all the harrowing pain and sorrow accumulated over centuries of war carried no greater significance. We need to believe it was all worth something. But this is also why anti-war films, or at least the effort towards them, is so important. If you talk about heroics that cost mountains of human life, Becker continues, you have to find out why such heroics are practiced in a given social system. Who is scapegoating whom? What social classes are excluded from heroism? What there is in the social structure that drives the society blindly to self-destructive heroics. The real problem, however, is finding some kind of non-destructive alternative, and then translate that into transformative cinema. Monet argued that war films can only be as anti-war as their viewers already are. And while I think it is true that anti-war statements generally don't reach those who need them the most, that being, those who are most deeply immersed in their hero system, I don't fully share in her pessimism. Sigmund Freud believed that human beings were violent out of lust, and if he was right, then warfare is a fatality for all time. But if we are violent out of animal fears, as Becker now argues, then there is a small possibility that those fears can be examined and calmed. Becker imagines an ideal world that achieves this by putting the problem of death central, a world that admits to its own fear of extinction and insignificance, and questions its own hero systems. A world in which leaders always act fully aware of the implications of their own deeply hidden fears, and always consider the full weight of every single human life and its suffering. Such a world, unfortunately, is little more than an utopian fantasy, although Becker does mention one social system that comes somewhat close to it, and that is democracy. With its free flow of criticism, art and science, democracy acts in constant defiance of its own cultural fictions, which is why authoritarians despise it so much. It seems ridiculously intent on discrediting itself, as Becca put it. When it comes to cinema, democracy at least provides the possibility for war films that urge us to really face the mirror, to look critically at ourselves instead of clinging to stories that merely give us comfort. And by continuing to push us into self-reflection, by helping us understand our human condition in creative and insightful ways, maybe then, someday, we might just find that tiny measure of reason to balance destruction.
Alright, that is the end of the video.
This video was...
Alright, so what do you think? Have you got anything more you want to add?
I mean, I think like throughout our commentary on the video, I think like we pretty much lay out that like, yeah, there is a balance to these things that probably should be hit. I think that is, I think the point at the end that verbalized it in a way that I think is correct is that like we have these systems that we need individually, but when they're broadened out to like the society-wide level or even just like a group dynamic, they can be like ultimately destructive. And I think it's hard for humans to engage with that critique. Not as like an intellectual exercise, because we seem to be fairly good at understanding abstract concepts or interacting with them, but like the way in which we act those out, I think, is really hard because we are individuals. So it's hard to interact. It's hard to act those out in the world, because we need to do it as individuals to find meaning. But at the same time, in a group setting, it can be destructive. But it's like, how does the individual like manage against that, or like how do they try to prevent that from happening? It's like a
I don't think this is like a totally solvable problem, but I think it's just good to be aware that the price you pay for valuing anything is that you may be willing to make too high a sacrifice for it. And I think it's good to just be aware of the price you pay for the things you value.
Yeah, that's probably just a good baseline to have. In terms of anti-war cinema as a whole, yeah, it does seem to run into practical issues like we've talked about, of like there do just seem to be like some concepts that humans are inherently attracted to, at least from my perception, that like whether it be like hero systems or when we're talking about our concepts of like good versus evil. I think the biggest one that was the hardest for us to like figure out how we would operate without is like a conflict system, or how to create narratives or like analyze narratives without conflict. And then that breaks it down even further to just narratives in general. Like, what is a narrative without conflict in it? Can you say that's a narrative without, like, if it doesn't have any conflict in it? I think that's probably the biggest thing that you would have to tackle when it comes to anti-war stuff like that, because a lot of the specific points that he brings up, like you mentioned before, like, well, creating like, let's say we make like a true anti-war movie, humans could interact with it the same way that they're engaging with war movies right now, where we're outsourcing our morality to engaging with anti-war movies. So it seems like there needs to be like a broader critique about like conflict in general, and like how we interact with that concept and how we derive meaning from conflict probably would probably be the main takeaway that you could think about or try to examine, try to cross-examine mentally. But I have to think more about that.
Okay, yeah, we probably, that's like a lifelong project, thinking about,
of course,
things like that, right? We're never going to be done thinking about that. Well, anyway, this was great. Thank you for hanging out with us. Do you have anything you want to shout out or promote or tell people to find you on social media or anything like that?
I mean, not really. Like, I have an Instagram. I could check it, right? I always forget how I spell my own Instagram name.
Yeah, Claire's an artist, for anyone who didn't catch that at the beginning.
Yeah. I use my actual name for my Instagram. It's called Christian Longoria _design. So if you want to check out my art stuff, you can check there. And if you want to follow me or whatever, or if you like want to commission anything or anything, my email is always open, which is in my profile description. But other than that, I don't really have anything else to shout out right now. So
okay. Claire also has an adorable cat called Marsh, so give Marsh some pets for me.
I'll give him all the pets next time I see him.
Yeah. So I'll be raiding out momentarily, and thank you for joining us, and see everybody next week.
Yeah. Bye, everybody. Thanks again for it. So see you later.